reunion up in Kamehameha last week, all weekend. So if there's some residue, that's for us. We was all week celebrating up there on campus. Dr. Keanu Sile.
Hello, everyone. Oh, packed house. Oh, awesome.
Oh, you should have stayed at the pagoda.
I'm just asked to give talks. I don't organize talks. Well, my name is Keanu. As Steve said, I celebrated my 35th reunion. His was his 40th. Oh, we're getting old. But what he was making mention of was this book right here, Uamalke'ea. So this book is actually a watered-down version of my doctoral dissertation. So it covers Hawaii's history from 18th century to the present, from Kamehameha all the way till today. It was really funny. I was in London about three weeks ago, and I got back together with one of my doctoral committee members, Professor Matthew Craven from the University of London. He's a professor of international law over there. So I said, hey, Matthew, here's a book, a new history book. It's the dissertation, but watered down. And as he went through it, he says, wow, got pictures. I started laughing because the dissertation does not have pictures. So we use this up at the university. It's required reading. Yeah? And Kamehameha Schools actually at Kapalama purchased 500 copies. It's now the new history book for Honors Hawaiian History. So I would highly recommend that you folks buy one. It's not that bad, but you folks are selling for $30?
Yes.
Yeah, $30. The history behind this book. Okay. So I'm up at the university. I already have my PhD. I'm teaching poli-sci courses. And this one person from Pearson Publishing comes to my office. Pearson is one of the big publishers. And he says, Keanu, are you teaching poli-sci 110? I said, yeah. Can I interest you in this book for poli-sci 110? I was like, wow, it's got everything in here. How much is this? Well, before I answer that, here's some PowerPoints. Here's some sample tests. I mean, he had everything. I was like, wow. How much is this? He said, well, for you, it's free. You just got to require your students to buy it from the bookstore. $130. And I was like, $130? Nah, I'm going this route. Meaning, have the students pay $130. But it made me realize, and that's how much books are at the university. But it made me realize that we need a book that is like that. So I approached my friend and classmate from Kamehameha, Tony Bissett, who's the director of Pu'a Foundation. I said, you know what? Told a story about Pearson. I said, why don't you guys front the money and we'll go ahead and make a book from my doctoral dissertation, make it very user-friendly, make it academic. And then for the teachers that are using it, free PowerPoints, sample tests, resources, everything. And they get it for free. But the students got to buy it for, well, over there it's $35. So I made amends, right, from $135 to my students. Now I say now it's $35. So you can't argue that it's a good deal. Yeah. But there's a lot of people getting involved in getting this information out in a very professional way, right? That first professional way is through education. And it's through the institutional system that will affect all of you here, whether you like it or not, because your kids are going to be going into schools, public school, private schools. College of Education is also teaching this. So this semester, I'm actually teaching a course with the cohort of Kamehameha teachers who are getting a master's degree in education, right? And they're also going to be learning how to use this book to teach. So we're getting into the term what is called pedagogy. Pedagogy is the how to teach, not the what to teach, right? Because it is difficult to teach this information. And what's difficult about it is not regurgitating what you read, but being able to answer the questions that are coming from the students. Because when they start asking questions and you can't answer it, then you shouldn't be a teacher, right? So one thing that I learned in the Army, before you train the soldiers, train the trainers. Yeah. In this way, before teaching the students, let's teach the teachers. And that's an ongoing process that I'm a part of, okay? I'm not part of the sovereignty movement, okay? I'm into education, I'm into information, and what I do with information is based upon information I can verify, okay? So, Now, where we are today, this evening, for the presentation. Unjust war with the United States. Now, that's a heavy, heavy statement right there. It's like, whoa, war. Well, you folks know I've always been saying Hawaii was occupied, right? Did you know occupation is part of war? It's just I never touched on that. It was just a variable in the equation. We are in a state of war. But what got me to the point where I needed to zero in on the legal framework of this, not the rhetorical framework, where I'm going to try to convince you. I know that this information may cause some problems with you, right? It's okay. But I'm not here to be your counselor. I'm not here to be your psychologist. All I'm here to do is talk about and share this information that has profound ramifications. When I went to London, because I'm involved in a new stage of international proceedings, when I went to London to secure a law firm onto my legal team, which I did, they're on my legal team, I needed to prepare a brief that they will need to read beforehand. You don't just walk into this law firm that represents countries in international proceedings and sell them a story, right? Because if it's frivolous, they're not jumping on it. In fact, you probably won't even get through the front door. I needed to put together a brief, articulate why Hawaii's occupied, right? I normally, like what this book does, this is an expose of Hawaiian history and law and the general gamut of international law, right? And why the Hawaiian Kingdom still exists. In these proceedings, these international proceedings stemming from the Larson case, which I'll be getting into, now they're getting into the legality of the issue. And when you go to speak to people who have knowledge of this information, you have to make sure that you know the question before they ask it. And if you need to know the question, you better know the answer to that question, because then you're going to look foolish, right? So I did my own due diligence, and I prepared this brief that explains why we are in a state of war, right? And that has opened the doors. It just put everything into context. Now, when I returned from London, I went ahead and expanded on that brief to put it in an article form, which is an educational article, academic article. So what I put together in this article is now before the European Journal of International Law, their peer review. And I'm going through that process right now to get it published, okay? So at every step of this process, you don't sell things. As an academic, you back it up. And if you can't back it up, it goes nowhere, right? This is going places, right? So I get more comprehension of this information in Europe than I get here in Hawaii. No, I'm serious. It's like I got to teach you what is international law before I can have a conversation with you. It's kind of tilted up my way. Like, hey, let me teach you something so I can converse with you. But we have to, because we didn't know this, right? But when I go to Europe, they already know it. They know the construct. They know the terms. They know what is war. World War II is just around the corner for them, right? Especially in Italy. Okay? So I can assure you that this information is gaining major traction outside of Hawaii, and more so in Europe, okay? So what we have to be mindful of is our people here in Hawaii need to be educated. And there's a reason why we don't know this information, because we're led to believe something that's not true, okay? That's what happened. When Hawaii got taken over, denationalization, brainwashing started, formal policy in 1906, called Program for Patriotic Exercises in the Public Schools. And from there, it just hit us hard, right? The Hawaiian language was banned. The Hawaiian language is not the native language. The Hawaiian language is the national language. Okay, laws were enacted in Hawaiian and English. It wasn't the natives in the corner talking Hawaiian. Okay, it was a national language. But that was banned. So if you were Japanese in 1906 attending a public school and all you spoke was Hawaiian, you get beaten too. It wasn't just the natives. But the majority of the students that felt the brunt of that were natives, because we were the majority at that time in the schools. Okay? By the time I got to my parents' generation, when my dad went to St. Louis, it's already institutionalized. He didn't know anything. By the time it got to me, when I went to Kamehameha, Stephen brought that up. We weren't taught this. We didn't know anything. And that's why I went on to a military college after high school, where I got my commission as a second lieutenant, and went off and got my degree at UH, and then played Army. I didn't know. Now we're all being faced with this information. Now we know. And sometimes it's hard to swallow, right? Been there, done that. But with me as an academic, my job is to present information that has already been vetted, okay? So I'm not here to debate with any of you, right? It is what it is. It's under peer review right now. It's stemming from my doctoral dissertation, my other journal articles that have been published through peer review. That's the process where it gets critiqued. And it's not debated. See, to critique is not a debate. A debate is to argue. A critique is to say, cite that. Where'd you get this? Wrong theory. See, that's critique. Critique is good, right? Okay, argument, that's rhetorical. That's like who's going to win. And you don't argue about what happened. You either know it or you don't. It's called falsifiable information. It's like this is a remote control. Do not argue with me that it's a remote control. It's self-evident, right? What you argue or you debate about is not what it is, but how you can use it, right? So I'm a firm believer to use it by pointing things. And see what happens when you use a remote control? Things happen. Some guy says, no, this is a good thing to throw at somebody's head. Okay? We'll debate that. And I will say no, and you'll say yes. And we'll argue. But we're not arguing whether or not this is a remote control. So I always talk about history as a matter of falsification. Either it is or it's not. It's like you're either hapai or you're not hapai, right? And you're not halfway, right? So for those who don't know hapai is pregnant, right? You're either pregnant or you're not pregnant. You're not almost pregnant, and it's debatable. No. We'll take the test. It's not a debate. Okay. You guys okay? Okay, so before I get into this information, I want to talk about some terminologies, right? Since Steve brought it up. Okay. The word state, okay? State, all it means, it's what is called a juridical person, okay? As opposed to a natural person. See, a natural person, I can touch, right? A juridical person, I can't touch. It's like grabbing smoke, right? You can see it, but you can't grab it, right? So a juridical person is like Bank of Hawaii. It's a corporation. Can you physically grab Bank of Hawaii? No. But you can grab the president of Bank of Hawaii who speaks on behalf of that juridical person. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. Okay. So, as a juridical person, more specifically a subject of international law, a person or subject of international law becomes a person when it's recognized as an independent state. Independent state. Now, the word independent is a political term. It is not a physical attribute, being independent of something. Independent is a political term that ties to a state called an independent and sovereign state. Independent means only your laws exist over that territory independent of other laws over other territories that are independent. So Great Britain is independent. It's an independent state where only British law applies to British territory. The United States of America is an independent state where only American law applies to American territory. They're independent of each other. Make sense? And that sovereignty is authority of that state. So sovereignty by definition means supreme authority. That's all it means. Sovereignty is not in the people. Independent and sovereign state, that means sovereignty is in the country. Make sense? Now, a government is an entity, not a state. A government is the body that exercises that sovereignty of the state, that authority. Okay? So like in the case of Bank of Hawaii, the CEO for Bank of Hawaii exercises the authority that Bank of Hawaii has as a corporation. But Bank of Hawaii as a corporation can't speak on its own. because it's a juridical person. It's not a natural person. It needs a voice. So the CEO of Bank of Hawaii is the voice for Bank of Hawaii. Now, if the CEO from Bank of Hawaii doesn't show up to work because he was kidnapped, does that mean Bank of Hawaii doesn't exist? No, it's just nobody speaking on its behalf. That's why in the case of international law, you can overthrow a government without overthrowing the country and its sovereignty and its independence. Its laws still exist over its territory. Okay? Now, today you have what is called the sovereignty movement that's operating on a false premise. They're operating on the premise that Hawaii is not independent yet, and they want to become independent. That's why it's called an independence movement, right? Moving toward independence, moving toward sovereignty. If sovereignty is in the country, then sovereignty is still in the country until somebody can show that it was transferred to another country. And you need a treaty. There's no treaty, right? So these are the terms that are very important to understand when you're looking at Hawaii's history. Because if you start to borrow certain terms without knowing the definition, it's like taking baseball terms and applying it in a football game. And it just sounds more confusing, or if anything, it would create more confusion. You guys with me? Okay. So terminology is so important. I just got back from a class that we taught at Maui College last week. I was part of, I think, about six doctorates, 6 professors. And we all had art parts to teach in this Hawaiian Studies 300 level course. And the first thing I started off with was terminology. It was all terminology. And you could see the look in the students because they were going, I thought it meant that. No, it means this. And it's not like you ask what you think the definition is. When you're in college, it's called look it up. It's called dictionary. Sovereignty. Oh, that's what sovereignty is. Gee, everybody says sovereignty is something. It's right there, supreme authority of a state. Okay? So terminology is very important. So I'm going to be operating with this terminology. If you folks get a little confused, and I'll see you folks. I can see all of you. You cannot see each other. So I can see guys getting pissed off. I can see empty blood vessel going boom, 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 boom. And I see Uncle Vic smiling. And I see the full gamut of comprehending this information. And it's okay, right? But I'm going to operate on these terms, okay? And I'm going to try to make it user-friendly. Okay, you guys with me? Okay. So, what is the status of the Hawaiian Kingdom before we talk about war? Because you can only have a war between independent states. Yeah. You cannot have a war within a state. What you have within a state, if there's violence, it's called a revolution, not a war. Okay? Aggression going on, that's a war. Okay? So if we're going to look at war, if Hawaii is in a state of war, we first need to establish what was Hawaii. It had to have been an independent state in order for me to speak of it in that war context, because in international law, war is legal. It's not illegal. War is legal. In fact, international law regulates war. It doesn't ban it, right? It regulates it. And I'll get into the reasoning behind that. So, in 2001, the Permanent Court of Arbitration in Larson versus Hawaiian Kingdom stated in its arbitral award, in the 19th century, the Hawaiian Kingdom existed as an independent state, recognized as such by the United States, Great Britain, and various other states. What that legally means right here is when they say the United States recognized the Hawaiian Kingdom as an independent state, they're saying the United States recognized only Hawaiian law applied over Hawaiian territory. That's what that means, right? Great Britain also recognized that, which means when their nationals come into Hawaii in the 19th century, they're under Hawaiian law. You get into trouble, you get prosecuted under Hawaiian law. Now, not all states in international level were independent. One example would be Japan. Japan was not independent until the latter part of the 19th century, 1890s. Prior to that, it was just recognized as a state, not independent. And it had unequal treaties with Great Britain and the United States, Russia, and all the rest of them, where if a citizen of the United States gets into trouble in Japan in 1880, that person can only be prosecuted under American law, exercised by the American consulate, which serves as a court. It's called consular jurisdiction, meaning they had no respect for Japanese law. Right? That means they did not recognize Japan as being independent. Okay? And it was King Kalakaua who was asked by the Meiji Emperor in 1881, would he be the first power to recognize Japan as an independent state? In the law books, or the history books, they say Great Britain was the first to recognize Japan's independence in 1894. It was actually recognized by the Hawaiian Kingdom. Queen Liliuokalani, Minister of Foreign Affairs, notified Ambassador Irwin in Tokyo. We recognize Japan's full independence and that any Hawaiian subject, is subject to Japanese law, and they rescinded consular jurisdiction. That was the first country to recognize Japan's full independence. Great Britain was a second, right? So I was invited to a conference in Cambridge, University of Cambridge in England, and it was on non-European powers in the age of empire. When I presented it at this conference, and our papers are going to be published in Oxford by Oxford Press as chapters, they were tripping out because they all thought Hawaii was like other non-European powers trying to get into the family, but we weren't civilized enough. We weren't Christian enough. You know, all these arguments that were used to prevent recognition of independence. And here's Hawaii affording recognition. You know, so even in Europe, they didn't know about Hawaii's history. And now they're going back to their records, and they're going, they knew it back then, they just don't know it now. Sound familiar? Like us? So it's okay for not knowing, right? But it's not okay for not knowing when you know you don't know, because now you got to know. Okay. Now in 1893, there were only 44 independent states. 44. Hawaii was one of them. Only 44. In 1945, when the United Nations was created, there were only 46. But today, there are 193. All these countries that made up 193 from the 46 were former colonies of these independent states, like France, Great Britain, Germany, and so forth. But Hawaii was there since the 19th century, fully recognized by the Permanent Court of Arbitration. So that's our starting point, right? So we don't have to argue that Hawaii was an independent state. That's a falsifiable information. This just verified it, right? No debate, right? We're an independent state, 19th century. Okay, now we start moving. Okay. So Judge Greenwood, who also served on the tribunal in Larson versus the Hawaiian Kingdom at the Permanent Court of Arbitration, he's noted for saying traditional international law was based upon a rigid distinction between the state of peace and the state of war. Okay. Every state, every independent state strives to be in peace because that's where you're supposed to be, right? But if you go to war, you go to war. He further says, it's either this or that. It's like, you're either hapai or you're not hapai. Right? You're either a state of war or you're in a state of peace. There is no middle stage. Yeah? It has to be definitive. Because war, in the eyes of international law, was a means of dispute resolution. Yeah. Where the countries serve as judge, jury, and executioner. That's what it was. There was no body that countries can go to resolve a dispute, right? That only started in 1899 by creating the Permanent Court of Arbitration as a means to hopefully give some recourse to countries so they don't go to war and people die, right? But you can only go to war if you have a dispute. You cannot just arbitrarily invade a country because I don't like the guy over there. That's called an unjust war, a war of aggression. Today, a war of aggression is a war crime. But did you know war of aggression back then, 19th century, was still illegal? It wasn't a crime, but it was still illegal. Okay? So your country, if invaded by a bigger country that just wants to take you, international law actually protects your country. But it doesn't maybe stop the violence, but it actually protects the country. Okay? So because, here we go. Jumped ahead, sorry. So it was a form of dispute resolution. In order for it to be legal, it had to be justified. And that's why you have what is called a just war and an unjust war. That's the difference. But you still have war, right? Unjust, just. Okay. International law regulates war, and it was customary as to how war is regulated, right? So before 1893, it was understood under customary international law when one country invades another country and occupies that territory, they have to administer the laws of the occupied state. Okay? That particular provision was later codified in 1899 called the Hague Conventions. Right? Codification, not recreation. Right? It's codification of existing law. Okay, that's important to know. Okay. So what you have in a state of war, and state of war can only be triggered under statements that are recognizable under international law. Meaning, because international law, inter means between, right? As opposed to intra, within. So international law is a law between nations, right? So if you have a law between nations, you don't have a legislature above them. You don't have a court above them. They're all co-equal. What creates a custom is the pronouncement of things by heads of countries. So if the head of the United States says something, the whole world will take what that person says literally because it could trigger something. Notice why people are very concerned about Trump? Because he's saying all kind of stuff. No, I'm serious. He's walking on the path of creating problems for the United States. Okay. Now, but international law does not recognize a vice president's statement. Doesn't recognize a secretary of defense statement. It only recognizes the head of state, because that head of state represents the state. Okay? So there are certain trigger words that will move a situation into a state of war. Well, first of all, you need physical invasion, right? But the physical invasion could be justified, so it won't be war. You might invade a country because American lives, from an American perspective, is being threatened. So you're sending in troops to protect American lives. That's not war. That's protecting your citizens. And that's justified in international law. But if you go in with an invasion and you overthrow a government of that country, okay, that's an act of war. That act of war will trigger a state of war. Notice even today, Dick Cheney is trying to tell the president, say act of war with regard to Russia and the meddling. So they change the situation into a state of war, which allows you to do certain things, right? But you don't want to say that yet. You got Dick Cheney only saying that. But if Trump says it, whoa, something's going to trigger, right? So you have other trigger words such as surrender, right? You have other trigger words as armed forces, right? Those are certain words that will move things into a state of war. But once it moves into a state of war, you pretty much have basically 4 stages, right? And the object is to get back to a state of peace, not to stay in a perpetual state of war because it ruins the economy. It ruins all kind of stuff, right? So the first stage is the act of war. That's what initiates state of war from a state of peace, act of war. What's interesting is I was meeting with Joan Lander from Namako Kaina in Kau at her house, myself and my cousin Kaui. And she was telling me she never thought, because she had the video called Act of War. You guys remember that? 1993, Act of War. She had no idea what it actually meant. Nor did I, none of us. Until now, because now international law is defining what is an act of war. Because what is important is, Namako Kaina, this film production company, did not come up with that term. It actually came from President Cleveland in his message to Congress, which I'm going to explain. The head of state said it. See, that's different. That's different. So you have first stage, act of war, which creates a state of war. It's no longer a state of peace. And certain laws of peace are superseded by laws of war. Okay? Oops, sorry. Should be second, you have an armistice, ceasing of hostilities. It's called a surrender. But the surrender doesn't change the state of war into a state of peace. It only ends hostilities. Normally followed up by belligerent occupation. And then fourth, treaty of peace. Once you have a treaty of peace, then it moves back to a state of peace. That's how it works. Okay? And then you have 3 types of warfare. You got physical warfare, right? Army, Navy, Air Force, Marines. You also got economic warfare. economic warfare can actually be done in the country that is waging war against another country. You got embargoes, right? Back in the 19th century, you had what's called privateering. You can license. It's like legal pirates, where they take whatever you have, your property, right? If it belongs to an enemy of the country, and you take it to a prize court and you liquidate it, and then you get a cut, right? Did you know if you're at war and you're in the country that your country's at war with, you run the risk of losing all your property being taken away? That's economic warfare. They will take it. That's fair game. Make sense? So can you understand why you don't want to always be in a state of war? You want to be in a state of peace, right? So when a state of war starts, you see nationals of that country, they're gone. They're leaving. They're leaving everything behind. And then you also have psychological warfare. Okay? Education, pamphlets, all these kind of things. The whole purpose of war is to overwhelm the other side. That's all. And to control them. To end the war. That's what warfare is. Okay. Now, let's take a look at certain terms called trigger words that were used back in 1893. This is the Hawaiian Patriotic League. It's memorial to President Cleveland on December 23rd, I believe, 1893. The president of this organization at the time was Joseph Navahi, former Minister of Foreign Affairs. Also under him is John Cummins, honorary president. You got Pilipo, you got all of them. These are Hawaiian statesmen and attorneys. And they're writing this in English, right, to the President of the United States. They had the command of the situation. So this is what they said to the president. This past January, a political crime was committed. Whoa, political crime. Did you know at that time, it wasn't a crime, it was actually a delict. It's a violation of international law. See, a crime is when you can put somebody away. At that time, a war crime, you can't put away a country, so it's called a delict. Yeah? You can get reparations for that from this country. But here they're saying a political crime. It's almost like they're seeing ahead. Because in 1916, that's after World War I, that's when they created international law crimes, where individuals will be prosecuted. And here they're talking about a political crime was committed. Interesting, just how far-sighted they were. Yeah? So this past January, a political crime was committed not only against the legitimate sovereign of the Hawaiian Kingdom, Queen Lili'uokalani, but also against the whole of the Hawaiian nation, a nation who, for the past 60 years, had enjoyed free and happy constitutional self-government. Now here's another word right here that caused some confusions today. Self-government. Okay, you hear non-self-governing, right? You kind of hear that? Non-self-governing territory, right? That's colonization. A lot of times they refer to Native Hawaiians as an indigenous people with the right to self-determination because we are a non-self-governing entity. Self-governing means you're a state. Non-self-governing means you're not a state. Don't you think Navahi knew that they were self-governing? So they're speaking to the fact that we're a country. It's another buzzword, not for war, but shows you they understand what's going on. Where today we're still recovering our memory. You know? And then they go on to say, this was done by a coup de main of U.S. Minister Stevens in collusion with a cabal of conspirators, mainly faithless sons of missionaries. Point taken right here. Sons of missionaries, not missionaries. Everybody blames the missionaries for the overthrow. Wrong. It was the kids. And the kids weren't missionaries. They were judges, attorneys, owners of plantations. Well, they weren't missionaries. Right? So these faithless, I love that, faithless sons of missionaries. You can hear Kepalo in there somewhere. These faithless sons of missionaries and local politicians angered by continuous political defeat, who, as a revenge for being a hopeless minority in the country, resolved to rule or ruin through foreign help. Right there says a lot. First of all, foreign help. That's intervention. That's not internal. Right? The word coup de main. That's a buzzword right there. Coup de main is a successful invasion by a foreign country, as opposed to a coup d'etat, which is an internal revolt that is successful, called a revolution. You notice they didn't say coup d'etat. And they also mentioned further in this memorial, it was not a revolution. It was these faithless sons of missionaries that portrayed themselves as if they were a revolutionary group. This was an internal revolt and overthrew a tyrant queen. And we saved the day. It was all a lie. It was a coup de main. So when you talk about coup de main, you're talking war. That's what that means. It's actually in the Department of Defense definitions. Yeah, go look them up. Google coup de main. Yeah. Successful invasion and takeover. So, here's President Cleveland, what he said. See, now when we know international law, you know who to listen to, yeah? So if Blanc is saying something, because Blanc is reporting to the Secretary of State, Walter Gresham. Gresham is reporting to the President of the United States. Let's see what he says. Based upon what Blanc found, reviewed by Secretary of State Gresham, and now apprising the President. So the President gives this message to Congress. He says, on the 16th day of January, 1893, between 4 and 5 o'clock in the afternoon, a detachment of Marines from the United States steamer Boston, USS Boston, with 2 pieces of artillery landed at Honolulu. The men, upwards of 160 in all, were supplied with double cartridge belts filled with ammunition and with haversacks and canteens, and were accompanied by a hospital corps with stretchers and medical supplies. What do you think they're preparing for?
Bloodshed.
War. They're getting ready. Right there is an invasion. Okay? But what does Cleveland say to that? He makes a determination. He says this military demonstration upon the soil of Honolulu was of itself an act of war. Buzzword. Trigger word right there. Okay? President Cleveland's message also stated, on the one hand, the Queen had possession of the palace, of the barracks, and of the police station, and had at her command at least 500 fully armed men, several pieces of artillery. Did you know some of this artillery is actually over there in the barracks? They're from Austria. Pretty high-level artillery. Little different artillery from what I know, because I'm an artilleryman. Ours is more indirect fire. That one look pretty much direct, like naval gunfire. Indeed, the whole military force of her kingdom was on her side and at her disposal. By the Committee of Safety, these sons of faithless missionaries, by actual search, had discovered that there were but very few arms in Honolulu that were not in the service of the government. In this state of things, if the Queen could have dealt with the insurgents, see that word? Insurgents, that's what they were. To deal with the insurgents alone, her course would have been plain and the result unmistakable. Take them out. Marshal Charles Wilson was ready to go, even though the Marines were there. They're ready, right? President Cleveland continued, but the United States had allied itself with her enemies, had recognized them as the true government of Hawaii, and had put the Queen and her adherents in the position of opposing against lawful authority. Lawful authority is the United States, not these insurgents. The United States. She knew that she could not withstand the power of the United States, but she believed that she might safely trust to its justice. Now think about it, 160 men. I guarantee you, they'll probably get wiped out by the Hawaiian Kingdom Armed Force. Guaranteed. You know, the president says that. But you know what happens when you take out 169? Guess what? You got more coming. Yeah. It's called the United States of America, not a detachment off the USS Boston. Right? So the Queen was smart. And she knew she's playing with fire, because fire is right in front of her. She's got to play it right. So what she did was armistice. Right? Second stage, armistice, called surrender. So she writes, I, Lili'u Kalani, by the grace of God, and under the Constitution of the Hawaiian Kingdom. Notice the word under. She wasn't absolute, she was under it. Did you know there's a provision in the Hawaiian Constitution at that time that says no one shall sit upon the throne who has been convicted of an infamous crime, insane, or an idiot? That's Article 24, I think. 24, 26, yeah. That means you're under the Constitution, because if you're an idiot, you're not going to be there too long. You know. She was by no means an idiot, nor insane. She was very akamai. Yeah. So she solemnly protests against any and all acts done against myself and the constitutional government of the Hawaiian Kingdom by certain persons claiming to have established a provisional government or an acting government, a temporary government. That's what provisional means. That I yield to the superior force of the United States, whose ambassador, called a minister plenipotentiary, His Excellency John Stevens, has caused United States troops to be landed at Honolulu and declared that he would support the provisional government. Buzzword, trigger word, troops, armed conflict. Now, to avoid any collision of armed forces and perhaps the loss of life, I do this under protest and imperiled by said force, yield my authority or executive authority until such time as the government of the United States shall, upon the facts being presented to it, undo the action of its representative and reinstate me in the authority which I claim as the constitutional sovereign of the Hawaiian Kingdom. What you're seeing here is a very, very well-written surrender. And the author, they say, of this was the former Attorney General Paul Newman, not the actor. Maybe his great-grandfather, I don't know. But Paul Newman from the Kingdom era was an Attorney General at that time and advised the Queen. This is very much worded in a very specific way, but it is a surrender. But clearly you can see it's an unjust war, yeah? It's an unjust war. That's what she's saying. It's an unjust war. Now the president will have to determine whether or not it is an unjust war because she asked the president to look into it. It's her position it's unjust, but asking the president to look into it. He further tells Congress that when our minister recognized the provisional government, the only basis upon which it rested was the fact that the Committee of Safety, these faithless sons of missionaries, declared it to exist. It was neither a government de facto nor de jure. Again, buzzwords. Those are terms that you got to know. And it's all over President's message. Very legal, right? Because he's representing the United States and he's got to make sure that the United States is not putting themselves in a position but cannot deny what happened. So a government de facto. De facto doesn't just mean in fact. De facto government means that you're a successful revolution. That's what de facto government is. They said they're not a successful revolution because it wasn't a coup d'etat. It was a coup de main. It was a foreign invasion. They were saying they were a successful revolution. That was a lie. That was a lie. President Cleveland said it's a lie. They're not. So we don't have to debate that, right? Right. And then they said, nor de jure. De jure is a lawful government through lawful means, like appointment. Like Queen Liliuokalani represents a de jure government because she was nominated by Kalakaua and confirmed by the nobles. And then she stepped in 1891 after Kalakaua was dead. She's a de jure. She's not de facto. She did not have a revolution to take over. Okay? But they're saying they were neither de facto nor de jure, which means they're self-declared. That's all they are. They're self-declared. This is the first sovereignty group in Hawaii. Just say you exist. And just keep telling people you exist over and over. Again, the term de facto means a government arising out of a successful revolution, and de jure is lawful. They're neither. Keep in mind war, yeah? That's what you got to keep in mind, the framework here. Then he makes a decision, a political determination. President Cleveland, this is what acknowledged what the Queen said. By an act of war, the government of a friendly and confiding people has been overthrown. Now what you just have there is from an unjust war to now the overthrow of a government. So you have the act of war, and now you have the consequence of the act of war. Government overthrown. That was a surrender. But in order to transform the situation to a state of peace, you need a treaty of peace, not a surrender, because you'll still be in a state of war. We don't have a treaty of peace. None. So at this stage, in 1893, December 18, when President Cleveland is giving his message, Hawaii has been in a state of war with the United States since January 16 to December 18. Now we have to find, did it change after December 18? Because right now you cannot argue with what the president said. It's fixed. It's war. Right? Not physical, but it's war. And I can tell you from that time on, okay, physical violence, one aspect of war was not used against our people. But you know what else, what the other forms of warfare was used against our people? Economic warfare, psychological warfare, in a means to control. Oh yeah, you definitely will see that, right? I just came from Ala. Oh, that's economic warfare right there. I'm like, who owns these places? I've never been to Ala. Recently, I was like, wow, that's economic warfare when you see it in this context, because that's not Hawaiians doing it. You know, so when you see it from this perspective, things start to get very clear, yeah? But at the same time, quite scary, right? So, belligerent occupation begins. That's the third stage of war. January 17th, the Hawaiian Kingdom comes under belligerent occupation. The government is overthrown, and the United States is in full control through their surrogate called the Provisional Government. And you know what the Provisional Government does? These faithless sons of missionaries, I like that. Faithless sons of missionaries. These kepalo, you know. You know, I like to use religion against them because they try to use it against us. But you know how they controlled an entire government? They took over an entire system by only changing the Queen and her cabinet. Yes. It says it right in the proclamation that the Queen and her cabinet, identified them, are hereby removed from office, replaced by the Executive and Advisory Council, right? Called the Committee of Safety. And then they forced everyone in government to sign oaths of allegiance to this regime under threat of the United States Marines who were there. And that's where the song Kaulana comes from. The Royal Hawaiian Band refused to sign the oath. And one of the lyrics in that song in English says, "Do not sign the paper of the enemy with its sin of annexation and loss of Hawaiian civil rights." That doesn't sound too cultural, right? Don't sign the paper of the enemy. Oh. Don't you think they knew what was going on back then? But we got to ask ourselves, when did that change? How come we don't know it? You know, I still listen to Kaulana Maile Alohaina in safe way. And nobody knows what they're singing about. Don't sign the paper of the enemy with its sin of annexation. And everybody's walking around. Just totally oblivious to what's playing. See, that's called psychological warfare. It worked. We got so subjugated, we don't know nothing. So the law of belligerent occupation recognizes two legal orders. This was very important. Two legal orders. That of the occupying state and that of the occupied state. See, normally when you're not at, well, not normally, when you're not at war, you're in a state of peace, you only have one government, one legal order. And the importance of that is that legal order must have effectiveness to carry out and execute the laws. So effectiveness is the cornerstone of sovereignty. You got to be effective, right? But when you occupy another country and you overthrow the government of the occupied state, which is why you're occupied, how can the occupied state be effective? Because they got removed. The occupier has effectiveness, but the effectiveness is to administer the laws of the occupied state. Did you know international law actually protects the person of the country, the state, during occupation? Because you have to administer the laws of the occupied state. How do you know what laws to administer? Remember the word independent? An independent state says Hawaiian law got to be administered. If I'm in Iraq, and the Iraqi government was overthrown, Iraq still exists as a state, right? But the Coalition Provision Authority, headed by Ambassador Bremer, they were administering Iraqi law because Iraq was still independent. So you see how important the word independence is? Even though you're not there as a government, that's part of the way this game is played. And according to Judge Crawford of the International Court of Justice, he says, belligerent occupation does not affect the continuity of the state, even when there exists no government claiming to represent the occupied state. So this is actually good. Our country was protected without us even knowing whether or not we got to protect it. That's important, right? It exists. So when Iraq was invaded and the Iraqi government overthrown, Iraq still exists even though Saddam Hussein's government wasn't around. The same with at the end of Japan, the end of the Japanese War, World War II. They overthrew the Japanese government, but that didn't mean Japan ceased to exist. It was still independent. Only Japanese law applied during the occupation. Same with Germany. When Adolf Hitler was killed and his Nazis were overthrown, that didn't mean Germany ceased to exist. International law protected it. Because that's what is called the law of occupation, belligerent occupation. So the provisional government, which was created by the United States ambassador, right, and there's proof of that. The Hawaiian Mission Archives got it. The actual letter of Minister Stevens admitting he recognized them before they were in control of governmental machinery, which they had to be in order to be a de facto government, because you can't be successful without being in control of the government, right? Right? How'd you overthrow it? So there's a letter from John Stevens telling Sanford Dole, Judge Dole, I highly advise you to not let anybody know that I recognize you, because you still got to be in control of the police station. Right there is clear they're not a real government. And that's what Cleveland was talking about. They're just a group set up by Ambassador Stevens to try to get Hawaii transferring it to the United States. But that entity was self-declared. It's a surrogate of the United States. It was their creation. President Cleveland said it. The minister recognized this entity. They were neither de facto nor de jure. President Cleveland said they're a surrogate of theirs through the actions of the ambassador. 1894, that provisional government changed its name to the Republic of Hawaii. So all they do is do a name change. And all those people in government, they then sign new oaths of allegiance to the Republic of Hawaii. If you don't sign it, you get thrown in prison. They basically just hijacked the Hawaiian government and turned it into an armed force. Then in 1900, the Republic of Hawaii changed its name to the Territory of Hawaii. Congress changed the name, called the Organic Act. It's an American law. Limited to U.S. territory, but they changed the name of their surrogate. Right? Then in 1959, the name was changed to the state of Hawaii. U.S. law, passed by Congress, which has no effect in Hawaii. Why does U.S. law have no effect in Hawaii? Because the big I, independence. Because we're independent. Right? Not that we're seeking independence. We are independent. So since the provisional government was self-declared, then so are its successors. That's just what it is. And that's a hard pill to swallow. Because my cousin is a cop in the police department. Sorry, bro. You're not really a cop. You think you're a cop. You still carry the sidearm and you put handcuffs on people and you put them in one prison, but you're still not a cop. See, the problem we got, we don't have the faithless sons of missionaries we can identify. We're looking at ourselves. And then we're like, uh-oh, how did we get to this point? Psychological warfare. We were led to believe something that's not true. Right? So we're just starting to peel the onion, yeah? You know when you peel the onion, you know what happens, right? You start crying. Even the tough guy is crying. No, I'm not crying, I'm not crying. Probably peeling the onion. So, some examples of the 4 stages within a state of war. Japan. December 7, 1941, state of war initiated. Okay? Pearl Harbor bomb. Now what's important about here, some people say, yeah, but the United States didn't declare war until December 8th, the following day. Right? So the state of war didn't start until Congress said, no. Actually, there's a court case on that. A federal court case, 1946. And it all centered on life insurance. Yeah. A U.S. naval officer, I believe his name is Banyan, died in the attack in Pearl Harbor. He had a life insurance, but there was an exclusion, a clause that excluded death during war. Yeah, it's actually in the health insurance. If you died at any place, any time, outside of war, the family can cash in. If you died during war, that's an exclusion. So they went, and the insurance company was New York Life Insurance Company. And the family was arguing, state of war did not begin until December 8th when the U.S. Congress declared war. So therefore, Mr. Banyan died during peacetime. Right? The judge says, no. The president made a political determination on December 7th. President Roosevelt said, by an act of war, Japan attacked the U.S. military in Pearl Harbor. And the president and the judge said, that determination, that political determination by the president, remember what they say? Created a state of war. That life insurance wasn't covered. It all stemmed from a life insurance policy. So you don't need a declaration of war. What the judge said, a declaration of war by the Congress is a mere formality. It's not a prerequisite. Because the real hostilities is taking place. Guys are dying. It doesn't wait until somebody says, well, let me make a declaration that it happened in Washington, D.C. Yeah, go tell that to everybody dying, right? So for Hawaii, to be in a state of war, there is no requirement to have a declaration of war by the Congress. And we can point to 1946 federal court, life insurance. So December 7, 1941, state of war initiated. September 2nd, 1945, surrender, ending hostilities. That was the armistice that was signed on the USS Missouri, right, in Japan. Okay. From 1945 to 1952, for 7 years, Japan was under belligerent occupation. General MacArthur was administering Japanese law. He was the military governor at that time. And then, September 4th, 1951, a treaty of peace was signed in San Francisco. It did not take effect until 1952, which is when the occupation ended. Then it went to a state of peace. So America was at war with Japan, in a state of war, since between 1941 and 1952. For Italy, January 1st, 1938, state of war initiated in Europe, Mussolini. September 2nd, 1943, the surrender of Mussolini. Actually, he was killed. Ending hostilities, the Italians took over their government. And then allied themselves with the Allied powers fighting the Germans. But Italy was actually occupied under belligerent occupation from 1943 until 1947. And then 1947, February 10th, Treaty of Peace. So, the Treaty of Peace in 1947 is what transformed the situation back to a state of peace. 4 stages regarding Hawaii Kingdom. January 16, 1893, state of war initiated, act of war, landing of U.S. Marines. Oops. January 17, 1893, surrender, the Queen, conditional surrender. From 1893 to 2017, belligerent occupation. Because we're not saying it doesn't mean it is, or it isn't. It's just we're not waking up to it. Belligerent occupation since 1893, January 17. There is no treaty of peace. That's why we're still in a state of war. And that's the basis of my larger article and brief and everything, because we're now moving into the nitty-gritty of stuff. Yeah? We cannot allow any wiggle room. We got to know what's going down, right? So today, the state of war ensues. So let's talk about consequences or what we can learn from the Japanese and the Italians with regard to the United States. Remember that economic warfare within your territorial jurisdiction? In the United States, Japanese assets seized during the state of war amounted to $85 million. Inflation counter takes it to $752 million today. There's an entity called the Alien Property Custodian, and they issue vesting orders. It's like grabbing property of enemies. It's private people, their property. You're talking stocks, shares, copyrights, houses, insurance policies. That's all personal property and real property. They're vesting it. All they say is you just been vested. Sort of like you just been hammered, you know, Dave Hammer, you just been hammered. Or remember Shaner used to do that? You just been Shanerized. You guys remember that? Oh yeah, it was on the radio. It's like it's a comedy. But this one is not funny. You just been vested. Gone. And you know what they did? They liquidated. Settled. That's part of the war effort. That's like me fighting a platoon on the battleground. Me, I'm fighting you and your property. I'm taking it. Because the whole purpose here is your fair game. Your country's at war with us. And that's what they did. They did that. They did during World War I as well. Italian assets seized in America during the state of war amounted to $62 million. Inflation counter, $766 million.
State of war.
According to Article 14 of the 1951 Treaty of Peace, Japan would pay reparations. Separate from the monies they collected, that America collected, you're going to pay reparations to countries that you occupied. So Burma, $200 million, Japan had to pay. Philippines, $550 million. Indonesia, $223 million. Vietnam, $39 million. The average across the board, $250 million. Using the inflation calculator, $2 billion was paid. So that's just looking at precedents, right? I'm not making a judgment here. That's what happened. Italy, according to its treaty of peace, had to pay a total of $890 million, right? Inflation counter. Soviet Union, 100 million. Albania, yeah. So let's kind of take this and just think about it. So, as a basis to calculate the amount of reparations owed to the Hawaiian Kingdom, which is 124 years, we can apply it, right? I mean, just for fun. Makes a good article.
170.
In the case of Japan, if we use that as a gauge, reparations to be paid by the United States could be calculated at $25 billion for 124 years of occupation. Almost like you can't even fathom that.
What about the treasury, though? They took a lot of the treasury.
No, I'm just talking, we're just using what the Treaty of Peace had with Japan. Yeah, I'm not making a snap judgment here. I'm just showing you and applying it to Hawaii. I'm not saying it's going to happen. I'm saying, See, it's called things that make you go, In the case of Italy, ended up being, it could be 12 billion. So that's kind of what things are when you look at through the lens of state of war. Yeah? That's how the game is played. Did you know Japan could not pay all that money? Otherwise, they would go bankrupt. It's actually in the treaty. So they made a decision there that Japan, in order for it not to belly up as a country, they would actually send over Japanese citizens to go work over there to build up certain things, which is valued at whatever that money is. Yeah, there's many ways of paying reparations. It's not just cash. Reparations is for damages. Right? That's all it is. So, make sense? Any questions of what we covered so far? Yes. Emily.
The rent for military bases, is that calculated?
Well, you're not supposed to. There's no renting during state of war. So the mere fact that that goes into reparations. That's.
Was that calculated in the 25 million?
No, that was just strictly. No, that was just strictly what happened to Italy and Japan. Yes.
So if your group is using the acronym of the acting government, so wouldn't you folks now be the new provisional government?
Oh, we're gonna get there. Yeah,
Okay.
We're gonna get there. See, because now this is the point where you go, now what?
Yeah.
It's like, oh, well, now what, right? Do we just go, yeah, I found out we're in a state of war. Hey, yippee. Gee, I'm a captain, battery commander, Hawaii Army National Guard. Yippee. I'm in the right army. Yes.
What is Cold War?
Okay, a Cold War, all it means is, a Cold War means that the belligerent states are not directly hitting each other, they are indirectly hitting each other. That's Cold War. That's what a Cold War means.
Spy
Right.
versus spy.
So a hot war is like World War II. That's a hot war. A Cold War is using surrogates to fight. So the Cold War was communism. Yeah. So the Cold War was really fighting against communism that Russia was exporting, or the Soviet Union was exporting at that time. And
So
the
does that
West
make
was fighting
you in
it.
a state of war if you're in a Cold War?
No.
No.
Yes. So it's not a war, state of war. Yes. But the Cold War could erupt into war like Korea, Vietnam. See, that's war. Right?
Last question.
Yes.
Okay, we had treaties with all these other countries, and yet they stood back and let the United States
Actually,
government do it.
they didn't step back.
So wouldn't they owe us reparations too?
Oh, see, now everybody's starting to think like we're in a state of war. Right? Okay, so here's the reason. Remember in 1894, did you know that you had 20 countries in Europe and some in South America that recognized the Republic of Hawaii, provided them diplomatic recognition? Yeah. Did you know that during a state of war, so in 1994, was there a treaty of peace? Okay, so it's not a state of peace, and it's not a new government seeking diplomatic recognition. That's a facade. So it's a state of war. So what does the rules of war say about a third state recognizing a surrogate of one of the belligerents? It's an act of war. And that by recognizing the Republic of Hawaii, they just became a party to the conflict. No, that's how international law looks at it. I covered that all in my article. So I'm not just coming to a conclusion there. That's recognized. So that means Great Britain, Japan, France, Germany, when they recognize the republic, they just entered into the state of war. Because during a state of war, there is an obligation on third states who are not at war to be neutral. You're not supposed to be getting involved. If you get involved on one of the sides, you just join the war. Now you're a party to the conflict. And they continue to recognize the republic to the territory, to the state, and here we are today. So there are more states that are involved in this state of war than just the United States, but the United States is the responsible state. These states are called associated states, but they're running with the responsible state. Go check out Alamoana.
Yeah.
Which state is this company from? Yes, and then you, sir. Yeah.
You had stated at one time that overthrow isn't the proper term, that it can't be said that it was overthrown because unless there was a declaration of war, the Queen couldn't have been overthrown. Is that true?
No. So there was an overthrow, though. What was overthrown in 1893? The government. Not the Queen as a person, the government. Right? Remember, that's what Cleveland said. By an act of war, the government of a friendly and confiding people is overthrown. That is not an overthrow of the state. The Hawaiian Kingdom still exists as a state, even though its government was overthrown. Right? That's why when President Cleveland was negotiating through Ambassador Willis from November 13 to December 18 with Queen Liliuokalani, how can you negotiate to get an executive agreement to go back to a state of peace if the Queen was overthrown? Actually, the government was overthrown. He said it was illegal. That means she's still Queen, and we're now negotiating with her to get it back to a state of peace. So you see, it's very important to distinguish between the state and the government. The state wasn't overthrown. It was still there. The only way you cannot overthrow a state. You can only acquire a state. You need a treaty to acquire it. Right? It's territory. Yeah. Yes, sir.
Yeah, what about two countries, Ukraine and Russia? Scotland and England. Scotland wants to be with the United States of Europe, but England doesn't want it. And what about Ukraine? We've been killing everybody.
Okay, so the question is about Ukraine. Ukraine, it's almost like a Cold War. No, it is. It's not a state of war between Russia and Ukraine. But Russian surrogates on the eastern border are fighting. These are Ukrainians. But they're saying Russian troops are coming in training them. But you notice Putin is not saying we invaded Ukraine, because if he says that, state of war. Okay? So what you have there is a revolution that is taking place. But it's not successful yet because Ukraine is still an independent state. What they're trying to do is overthrow the government. And that's the fighting that you have. That's called a revolution. Now, it's not a successful revolution, which is a coup d'etat. It's a revolution where Ukraine is dealing with individuals who have committed treason. That's not a war. That's a revolution. Yeah.
Rather remarkably, over here on the state building, the statue of Queen Liliuokalani, they changed the date of her reign, ending at 1917, where before it was much earlier, I think. Is there a reason for that, how that happened? Do you know anything about that at all?
Yeah, political. Hawaiians convince certain people to do something, which I think is good. But you don't have to have it written underneath a statue to know it.
That's true, but
Yeah.
I thought it was extraordinary.
No, I think these are little cracks that are happening. No, I completely agree, because when people wake up and get educated, they're going, hey, that's wrong.
She died.
So that's important. But see, people say, oh, she was only queen from 1891 to 1893, 2 years. No, she was queen all the way until she died.
Right.
Yeah.
It was Brickwood Galateria, I think, that initiated that.
And I think that's good, because it's part of education. We're realizing these things. But it's not that, oh, it's written there, so now it's for real. It's just what is written there is great because it's reflecting this. And that's important. That's education. Yeah.
Keanu, did the Turkey resolution have anything to do with those third-party countries?
Nah. Turkey resolution was a resolution passed by, he's a congressman. It was only basically telling the president, do not go back in. That's all it was. And Cleveland wasn't able to carry out the executive agreement because of political wrangling going on in Congress. The Turpie Resolution was a political act within the United States that sought to control the President of the United States to not carry out the executive agreement. That's all it was. Yeah. But the Turpie Resolution, it's a congressional resolution. Does that apply to Hawaii?
No.
Why? Because independent. See, it's the independent is important. Now, the Turpie Resolution applies to the United States because the United States is independent, and that guy Turpie is a legislator. But it wasn't signed into law. It was just a resolution enacted by one of the House.
So you said that the countries that we had treaties with that
Including Switzerland.
yeah, that supported the
Recognized the Republic of Hawaii.
so they're joining in the act of war.
Yes, well, that recognition, according to international law, through the rules of war, is an act of war. That it's fully understood as to being that.
Okay.
But the way when they recognized the Republic of Hawaii, it was under the impression that they were a successful revolution. They overthrew the Queen, and they're now the new government, and they're being recognized. No, that was the facade. That's the lie.
Okay, now my question, real question. So the Admissions Act is based on UN Resolution 1469 that recognized Alaska and Hawaii as the 49th and 50th state. That took a vote of the UN nation states for that to happen, right? So
Okay,
does
so-
that mean that they have now participated?
No. It's best to stick to that time because you can't deny it. 1894, you knew what Cleveland said. Period. You fast forward till 1950s, 1960s, indoctrination already kicked in. They didn't know. Even at the UN, they didn't know. Yeah, they didn't. In fact, I found a comment that was made that maybe Hawaii should have been given the option to be independent, but I guess they have a form of self-governance by being the 50th state. Now, whatever they said doesn't mean anything to this. What it shows is they didn't know that Hawaii was already independent. See, that's what that showed. Not that I rely on these guys to give me some sense of authoritative spoken word. They were just as confused as my dad in 1950 was. All he cared about was trying to get back into St. Louis after getting kicked out now. Hey, but he's got his diploma from St. Louis. He was there from kindergarten to sophomore year. And he taught off a brother. But yeah, so, yes.
Is the motivation just a land grab? Because I heard that maybe some leases are going to expire and they decided that they didn't want a chance to...
In 1893?
Yeah.
Actually, it was more about sugar. It was the tariffs, because you have what is called the McKinley Tariff Act of 1890. It centered on money. It centered on monies coming into the sugar plantation companies. They were making millions because they were selling sugar to America duty-free under the 1875 Reciprocity Treaty. Okay, they were getting fat. In fact, they were actually getting sugar from the Spanish colonies of the Philippines, bringing it to Hawaii and rebranding it Hawaiian sugar so they can collect money. So in 1887, okay, so actually 1884, coming up on the 10th year of the 1875 Reciprocity Treaty, which is a commercial treaty, was only supposed to last for 10 years, right? And Cleveland, who was president at that time, was actually getting criticism from sugar plantation owners in America that they're getting hit by Hawaiian sugar. Because these sugar plantations in America, beet sugar as well as sugar cane, did you know they were part of the Reconstruction era? So it cost a lot more for southern sugar to be processed than sugar being processed in Hawaii. And Hawaii was basically taking advantage of the fact that post-Reconstruction, Civil War. So President Cleveland said, well, we're going to open up trade to the east. So we're going to negotiate with the Hawaiian ambassador in Washington, D.C., that we will allow the 1875 treaty to continue if Hawaii, the Hawaiian government gives the United States exclusive access to Pearl Harbor. Not for naval, for commercial and reloading, for coaling, to continue off to the east to trade, right? And that's when it went before the Hawaiian legislature in 1884, and Navahi and Pilipo, all of them are saying, don't let it happen. So Kalakaua refused to agree to the lease. That's what prompted 1887 to come around, 3 years later. Just take out Kalakaua. You had the Bayonet Constitution. Then they ratified that reciprocity amendment called the Supplemental Convention that would allow sugar to continue to go in duty-free, and Hawaii, America has access to Pearl Harbor. Now in 1890, you have what is called the McKinley Tariff Act. McKinley, when he was a part of the Congress before he became president, introduced this bill that made sugar duty-free to all foreign sugar coming into America. And that was a final blow to these faithless sons of missionaries who felt threatened, so they wanted to get in. So that's what prompted this move to get in. But John Stevens, the ambassador, he didn't care about sugar. He wanted Pearl Harbor for military purposes, not for commercial refueling and recoaling. Yeah. So, you know, like they say with Trump, the investigators follow the money. That's how you actually find a lot of things. It's not about law. Law just regulates and explains. People's motivations, a lot of it is driven by greed and money. When you track the money, you can see where this thing is going. And that's what 1893 was all about, was money. Yeah, it was all money.
So is there like documentation of how like the 22 countries that
20
countries
Yeah.
that recognize the provisional government of the Republic of Hawaii?
Yeah.
Documentation or letters of some kind that show
Yep.
collusion, basically, like where is that?
Yeah, no, exactly. You know what's great about it is that guy, what's his name? The Howley guy that's always angry with people? No.
Which one? There's Rice, there's Parker.
Conklin, Ken Conklin. Ken Conklin. The angry, the guy who's angry all the time. Hey, he's an angry man. Oh, he has a website, and he has actually did a great job in actually photographing all the letters of recognition coming directly, which is at the archives, coming from these 20 countries. Thank you, thank you. There's the evidence right there. In fact, in my larger article, I cite the URLs in the footnote on where to access. This is what the president actually said from this particular country, or the king said.
Because does it show like the deals, the economic deals, like what was the benefit for them? Like, you know, see,
A doctoral dissertation or master's thesis got to look into that one. All I can say is the act itself was an act of war, because we're in a state of war. The only way that that act could have been a diplomatic recognition and lawful, if there was a treaty of peace before 1894. There's no treaty of peace. All you have is President Cleveland saying by an act of war, the government of a friendly people has been overthrown. And what's important is President Cleveland in his message didn't say the government of a hostile people was overthrown. You know, you don't only say that when you're at war. That's another trigger word. When you say a friendly and confiding people, you're saying it's an unjust war. And we just did a big boo-boo, and we got to fix this problem. Yeah. I didn't finish the PowerPoint now. I'm just...
I was just wondering, because the Queen made an executive agreement, but it wasn't complied with or carried out, would that be considered a treaty of peace?
That was the attempt. They were trying to negotiate peace. That's the negotiation. But it never was carried out. Just like the Treaty of Peace with Japan was signed in 1851, but it wasn't carried out until 1952. There is no doubt President Cleveland engaged in a move to take it to a state of peace. There is no doubt. No doubt. But it never went through because of the Turpie resolution. So thank Mr. Turpie for keeping Hawaii in a state of war with the United States. Yeah. So what happens here, when you look at it through a state of war, things can be interpreted very differently now than how we used to interpret it, right? So now let's take a look at the Ku'e petition. Just throw this out, okay? So did you know that during a state of war, the occupier cannot annex the occupied state? They can't, because you have to administer the laws of the occupied state. The only way you can acquire the state is through a treaty of peace, like the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, 1848, when Mexican territory north of the Rio Grande was transferred, right? We don't have that. There's no treaty of surrender. And you cannot annex a foreign state that is under occupation. You can't. Even if he said you did, you can't. Because if you did, then you just proved my point. You can't. Because that's not the evidence of the crime. Because yeah, you did it. But you did it. So let's take a look at the Kuwait petition. Was it actually needed?
Yes.
Nope. The Kuwait petition was not needed to kill the treaty. Because that was not a treaty of peace. That was a treaty of annexation. That cannot take place during a state of war. So it wasn't needed. So then we have to think, then what was the purpose of the Kuwait petition? I look at it this way. That was our people mobilizing and acting upon a threat. And they stopped it. Well, they did. Because Navahi, who was the president of the Hawaiian Patriotic League back in 1893, he used the word coup de main. He knew this was a state of war. And you cannot annex an occupied state, especially from an unjust war. So what we're doing here is we're starting to rethink a lot of things, because this is a very legal approach now, right? This is not what everybody understood. This is like Trump getting advice from an attorney and telling him what not to do and what to do, right? It's not that everybody has to agree with it. He's saying, well, based upon the precedents and the rules and the laws, I recommend you don't do this. This is all I'm doing. I'm presenting the legal framework of a state of war. I'm not saying everybody knew it. I'm not saying even the Queen knew it. I don't know. But there are indications she did, as I see from the written records, right? So we are just coming to that realization today. But we are in a state of war. We are. And in a state of war, does the state still exist?
Yes.
Right, because that's part of the rules. It does. It exists. So here I am, back in 1995. Kind of came to this conclusion going from the OMG to the WTF. Like that. It's like, oh my God. I'm like, what the fuck? You know, like, wait a minute. So, since 1893, we can say that there was no lawful government, right? Yes. But the Hawaiian state still exists. Legally, it's supposed to. That's how the rules work, right? Since elections cannot take place under the international law of occupation, okay, so why can't elections take place during occupations?
It's supposed to be administering the state's law.
Wrong government. You got a military government administering the laws of the occupied state, right? So let me ask you, who registers voters to vote? The governor's office. Just as I make it like it's legal. Let's just make it like it's legal. Okay, so it's the governor's office, right? That registers voters, right? Okay, so who runs the voting polls? The governor's office, right? Who calls the legislature into session? See, it's an executive function. That's the point I'm making. Executive branch. Not judicial, not legislative. Judicial only kicks in if there's voter fraud. Right? Okay, so let me ask you again. So can elections take place during occupation? No. Because we're on government. Who's our executive at that time? The Queen. Where's the Queen? Overthrown. You can't have an election. That's what happens during occupations. That's why the occupier administers the laws of the occupied state. They don't hold elections. The only time you hold elections is when the occupation comes to an end. Like in the case of Iraq. Remember all the Iraqis had blue fingers? Because they stuck their finger in the dye to show that they voted. That's what it did. That was setting the stage for the provisional government to take over, which is al-Maliki. The provisional government. Until a lawful election take place to confirm al-Maliki. Yeah. Yes.
So at what point will the occupation end?
Treaty of peace. We need a treaty of peace. The treaty of peace ends the occupation. That's the rules of war. You need a treaty of peace. Well, I'm not pushing for a treaty of peace. What I'm pushing for is compliance to the rules of war. Because it's not about getting them out. It's getting them to conform to the law And not saying all of us here going to take over when we don't know nothing. It's like, oh, I take over. Hey, take it easy, Uncle. It's all good. It's like asking you to go fly the airplane. Oh, who played you flew? See, watch Trump. That's what happens when you put somebody up there that doesn't know how to fly a plane. I'm serious. He doesn't understand the basic understandings of checks and balances. And he's always putting himself in a... See, I'm a political scientist. That's why I'm saying that. So we teach in Poli-Sci 130, Introduction to American Politics. We explain all that, checks and balances. That's Civics 101. The way Trump is acting is like, what is he doing? You know, but that shows that not anybody can be in government, you know. But once you're in there, though, you're going to be held accountable, and that's what he's feeling the pinch, the accountability, right?
Well, you don't want us to stay occupied.
Excuse me?
You don't want us to continue to be occupied.
Oh no, I want occupation to continue to comply with the law of occupation to prepare to deoccupy. Yeah. See, that's where we're at. I'm not trying to end the occupation. I'm trying to bring compliance to the law of occupation. Before I can bring compliance to the law of occupation, we have to be educated on what is occupation, and then before that, what is Hawaii as an independent state, and then we're all going back to basic education.
And who can speak for the state of Hawaii then? The Kingdom of Hawaii.
Okay.
When we're having these conversations, who is able to do that?
No, okay, so see, these are the ideas that come into mind, because you're asking the right questions within this construct, right? These are the questions that are good to ask, like, well, who does represent? Or who does say something or what, right? But let's start off with the basics. Elections cannot take place. So if elections cannot take place, how can governments be created? Before we ask who can speak, let's just talk about governments, because governments represent states, right? But governments are supposed to represent people, right? Election, right? Appointments, you know. But you can't do that during occupation. That's a problem. So are there any situations around the world that we could look at to find a precedence that we can kind of understand? See, and that's what I needed to think about. I wasn't like, oh, I'm going to come up with a plan because I'm Keanu. Nothing. I was still in a WTF mode. I'm like, what? Everything I knew is gone. Everything I thought is a lie. Wait a minute. I'm an officer in the military? Wait, what? You know, that was a lot of personal stuff. And I had to make personal decisions, right? And a decision that I had to be sure that I don't put my family into harm's way, right? These are the things that are more personable as opposed to what is legal, right? But I do know that only governments can represent states, not people. But people have to be in government to represent the state. Okay, so that's a problem. So I looked, and from my military training, I went, wait a minute. Came to my mind, governments in exile. So during World War II, let's use Belgium as an example. Did you know King Leopold, the King of Belgium, he was like Queen Liliuokalani under a constitutional system. He was actually captured by the Germans. Occupied Belgium, citizenry fled. They formed the government in exile. They formed what is called the cabinet. The Cabinet Council, which is comprised of Attorney General, Foreign Affairs, I don't know what else, what the terminology they had, but the basic ministers.
Yeah.
And under the Belgian Constitution, which is very, very similar to the Hawaiian Constitution, research got to be done on how did we get a lot of stuff in our Constitution where the Cabinet Council, made up of these ministers, can actually, in the absence of a monarch, serve as a council of regency, who are supposed to call the legislature into session to elect by ballot a permanent regent or regency. That's the function of a regency. But during occupation, when Germany occupied Belgium, they couldn't have an election. So they said, well, in light of the necessity, we're going to operate as the acting council of regency, a government in exile. Now that's something that we could follow, because it was done and it was successful. They actually did it, right? It's not theoretical. But they had to be in strict compliance to the Belgian law, strict compliance. Because once you do that, and you assume a role, that's called treason. It's called self-declared. Did you know you can only do it by necessity to not commit treason, to become what is called a temporary government by necessity. Did you know that's exactly what the provisional government tried to declare in 1893, that it was by necessity we needed to do what we did because they said the Queen was a tyrant. Did you know that was their justification? Go read the proclamation. Because they knew what they're doing is treason, but they're going to try to justify it. It was all a lie. So we actually could learn from them, right? So that's what we were thinking of back in 1995. So a provisional government, which gets into that name, acting government, provisional government, was established to represent the Hawaiian Kingdom, called the Hawaiian State in international law. We did that back in 1995. I was not part of a sovereignty group, but everybody thought I was. I was like, no.
Let me ask, was human rights recognized back then?
No.
Oh,
No.
oh, so that's why they didn't recognize our human rights.
Human rights came about after World War II. So you got the Convention on Civil and Political Rights. I think it's 1960s. Humanitarian rights is different though. See, humanitarian rights as opposed to human rights. Human rights are rights during a time of peace, state of peace. Humanitarian rights is during a state of war. That's why the word humanitarian law is basically the law of occupation, the laws of war. Because it applies to the humanitarian aspect of civilians and the protection of non-combatants, prisoners of war, right? That's the Geneva Conventions, 1949. Yeah, so humanitarian rights was always a part of the laws of war, but human rights came about as a result after World War II.
We didn't qualify for the humanitarian rights?
Oh no, we definitely, we're in a humanitarian crisis. Laws of war, the other word for that is humanitarian law. It's humanitarian law. So you can Google humanitarian law, laws of war.
Because them determining that Honolulu is over here, they're determining that Honolulu is going to be a sovereign, a sanctuary state or island or whatever. Well, what about our rights?
Okay, that's all that state of Hawaii stuff. That's all illegal. Yeah. We're in a state of war. And we have people in the state of Hawaii who don't even know they're in a state of war, and he is really not a governor. I'm serious. That's what this does. It just puts everything. So we're just going to talk about my presentation here to bring it to date, right? I teach a class on this a whole semester. Trust me, we got all kind of questions come up with students, which are good. It's just we don't have time here because it's only like 2 hours up. So can I continue? Yes. Okay. So we created a provisional government. And the principle relied on was the legal doctrine of necessity. Okay? It's a real doctrine. And they also say necessity is the mother of all inventions. You get very creative. But you got to be careful not to be so creative you violate the law. Did you know the doctrine of necessity can be used to justify actions? Right? Back in Fiji, there was a coup, an attempted coup. Okay? This guy spiked, right? He, what's it, about 15, 20 years ago?
Yes, he was the head of
About
the
20,
army. He was the head of the military.
17 years, nearly 20 years ago. So Spike basically captured, with other native Fijians, the prime minister. And the prime minister was Indian by descent. And they basically were taking control in their eyes to bring it back to the native Fijians. Because Fijian is a nationality. Because you can be Fijian, a Fijian citizen, but not be Aboriginal. Right? And a lot of Indian workers coming from India was brought in by Great Britain when it was a British colony to work in the fields. And they became a part of Fiji when it became independent. So these guys basically did a revolution. Attempted revolution, or revolted. They got caught, arrested, and the guy Spike, his defense for what he did, necessity. No, it's a legal doctrine. And he did not meet the benchmarks of what constitutes necessity, and he was convicted for treason. So he's now in prison, still in prison. We knew that case, so we're going to study that. Because how can we do something and claim something? We better look at precedents. Not just governments in exile, but am I going to be like Spike, claiming something that I'm not, and I'm only going to put myself in trouble, right? I might have the greatest ideas in the world, but if it's illegal, it's illegal. So let's learn from it. So this is the criteria for necessity. That Spike, the actions of Spike, as far as what was measured. An imperative necessity must arise of the existence of exceptional circumstances not provided for in the Constitution for immediate action to be taken to protect or preserve some vital function of the state. You notice it's focusing on the state, not the people, right? Second, there must be no other course of action reasonably available. Actions taken must be necessary in the interests of peace, order, and good government. It must not impair the just rights of citizens under the Constitution, and it must not have the intention of consolidating power. This is what they were using against Spike. Did he meet this? Actually, there were other courses that he could have done. That's what they determined. He violated rights of other citizens in Fiji despite their ethnicity or ethnic difference. Right? And it appeared that he was consolidating power into his group. That's treason. He tried to use this defense, but it didn't work. Guess what? We're going to understand why it didn't work before we do this. Yeah? So what we're going to do before 1995 was actually look into how we're going to be able to do it. This was not just getting, hey, let's go. No. Let's do some due diligence. Give me some intel. Let's look at what worked, what didn't work. Let's capitalize on successes, learn from mistakes. So the Hawaiian state exists, right? No question, yeah? Exercised by Hawaiian Kingdom government, no question, right? Queen Lili Ukalani, de jure. She was the de jure government, the lawful government. That government was illegally overthrown by the United States by an act of war. Not argument, right? That's true, right? By overthrowing the government, that state still exists. That's what I'm thinking. But again, you also got to think, maybe I'm off. Maybe I'm only looking at what I want to see. This thing got to be tested, right? It's not me selling you a story. Because we're playing a game here that it's like I'm holding a blade that's double-edged. Got to make sure I know how I'm holding it, right? Now, what we're going to do, we're going to create a provisional government. But we're going to do it right. See, the faithless sons of missionaries didn't do it right. There was too tunnel vision, yeah? And that's what hurt them. They're like Spike. Basically, they're Spike. And President Cleveland was the judge in Spike's trial. That's pretty much what that was. Yeah. So, the purpose, and we created the provisional government under Hawaiian Kingdom law through the Council of Regency, which is the Cabinet Council, in the Constitution of 1864. It's all there. Somebody said, hey, why did you do the 87 Constitution? Well, that wasn't even a Constitution. It's called treason. It was never ratified by the Legislative Assembly according to how it's supposed to be. Right? I covered that all in my doctoral dissertation. Because if we use the bayonet, oh my God, we're going to lose. We're going to be like Spike, this amount of time before I get on. So, the provisional government was created as officers de facto, but it doesn't represent the people. It can't, right? Just like governments in exile. But we're going to do something different. We didn't create a government in exile, we created a government in Hawaii. See, because the reason why the Belgian government didn't create a government in Belgium, but in exile, because if they did it in Belgium, they get killed by the Germans. See, we're going to do it in Hawaii because nobody knows nothing. Oh, greatest protection. People are not even going to take us seriously. It's perfect cover. Perfect cover. You know, talking about a good camouflage. Land right in. So somebody, hey, you went to sovereignty? Yeah, you know. Protect myself. Yeah. So, what is the mandate then of the provisional government? So first of all, we have no effectiveness, right? Because we can't. We're occupied. We know that. We're not trying to fight for effectiveness. The United States is one ineffective control, and they're occupied. The reason why they're not following the laws of occupation because nobody's holding that entity accountable. Right. And the reason why we're not holding that entity accountable because we don't know. We just like the blind leading the blind over here. Until somebody said, brother, open your eyes. We're really not blind. So now we muck all up. Oh. Now we get scared. Close your eyes. Now we see all the cockroaches. Oh. Brother, I saw you. You open your eyes. Don't make like you close it again. We have to open our eyes. So the first thing that we got to do in the acting government, we said, we're going to have a policy, a strategic plan, expose. We got to expose the occupation. That's all. We just got to expose it. That's all we can do. We're going to expose the occupation. I want to travel all over. I want to talk to people. I want to say, hey, this is Hawaiian Kingdom law. You got to follow Hawaiian Kingdom law. Well, who made you? Hey, I know. You never make me because I represent the Hawaiian state. Not you, but I'm still liable to treason. You can hold me accountable. And it was all going over Uncle's head, you know. But still education. Just got to educate. Yeah? A lot of times I hear Uncle going off or anti. It's okay. You know. To me, that's evidence of denationalization.
Yeah.
You never wake up yet. You know what happens when you wake up too early? Oh, you get grouchy. I met a lot of grouchy Hawaiians when they start waking up. So remember that Perfect Title company? That was part of exposure. Oh yeah, exposure. We say nobody owns land in Hawaii because titles couldn't be transferred after 1893. Who's the notary? Real simple. I'm just saying notary. And that created a firestorm. Oh, you said you don't own your property. And on top of that, we can prove it. So there was a conference that I was asked to attend, put on by the Hawaii Developers Council, July of 1997. And I actually got it. My friend Curtis Featherin actually filmed it. So I got it on CD or DVD. So I'm on this panel with Donald Lewis, who's with Perfect Title. Now the word perfect title is a play on the word. It wasn't perfect title because nobody has perfect title, right? It's called perfect title. You got to first find out how you don't have it so you know how to fix it. That's what the play was. It's called perfect title. So was him, myself, Bruce Graham, an attorney from Ashford and Riston, teaches land titles at the law school at that time, 1997. David Peach from Title Guarantee Escrow, president. Neil Hulbert from Alston and Hunt, representing Chicago Title Insurance Company, and an attorney from Bank of Hawaii to moderate. 500 people showed up at the Hawaii Prince Hotel. 500. Place was packed. They all wanted to see us get taken down. And we had slideshow. Not PowerPoint, slideshow. Fade in, fade out. Started to show what title insurance is. We started to show a patent after 1893, January 17th. Lili Okalani's name crossed out, handwritten, Sanford B. Doe. Oh yeah, straight from the Bureau of Conveyances. It's pulling all this stuff up. Did you know everybody has title insurance to pay off their loan? That's what we're showing. It's in the contracts. If there's a defect in title, title insurance pays it off. The banks are protected. That's what we're showing. Everybody was shocked. And we also said native tenant rights. Anybody with native tenant rights can get up to a quarter acre for their house lot. That's Hawaiian law. We showed it. That's why in the deeds it says reserving the rights of native tenants. It's going back to the Maile. That's part of the brainwashing we went through. We didn't know that. Everybody was just blown away. So as everybody leaves, I'm walking off the stage. Bruce Graham comes up to me and he says, Keanu, we got to talk. I said, okay, Bruce, what's going on? Now, we're a Perfect Title company. We're not a group. We're in the corner of Merchant and Richards, right? It's a partnership. They're across from Hawaiian Electric, yeah? And he says, you're taking these people down the wrong road. People are going to get hurt. I said, Bruce, I'm not here to argue with you, right? This is about land titles. And I sent you one of our title reports. My property, my family's property in Kuli'oho, no title. I said, that title report, all you got to do is go line by line and refute it. Because it's a title report. It's just like title guarantees title reports. And he says, I saw it, and I can't refute it. It is historically and factually correct. So I said, so what's the problem? He said, well, America's here. It's the proof. America's here, and that's his That was good timing. So he tells me, America's here, and that's just the way it is. And I said, gee, I didn't know America was involved with title insurance. Well, when you have an attorney telling you America's here, that's just the way it is. Oh, okay, that guy has nothing, right? So 1 week later, or maybe a couple weeks later, our offices get raided by the Honolulu Police Department, white collar crime unit, yeah, Lieutenant Hanagami, get arrested for racketeering, money laundering, tax evasion, and theft. Oh yeah, see what happens when you, for real. Because if this was frivolous, what are you worried about? You attack what is a threat, right? What if somebody down the street, Alii is claiming to be Jesus Christ? You're going to go talk to him. If that guy gets arrested for racketeering, money laundering, tax evasion, I want to set up a meeting in that cell block to find out, hey, who are you? Because why did they arrest you for claiming to be Jesus Christ? I'm not saying I'm Jesus Christ, okay? Because he got crucified too, so I'm not going to. I'm just saying you attack a threat, and I knew that. And that was just part of the process. And then people start believing what's in the newspapers. My own family is accusing me of stealing people's properties. Like, what? Then they drop out of charges, get me on attempted theft of property, a Class B felony, grand jury. I get indicted.
Theft of real property or theft of property?
No, exactly. That's the problem. You can't steal real property. It doesn't move. Actually, the definition of real property is immovable property, as opposed to personal property is called movable. Theft of land or land is not the subject of larceny. That's a rule. I knew that. But here they made that up. So then I ultimately get convicted of a Class B felony, attempting to steal somebody's house in Aiea, which I never went to. I just did a title report that showed you don't own the property. And you know what they use as the value above $10,000? The value of the house. I guess attempted theft of property. I went there. I was trying to grab the house, and I got caught. It's a joke. But the point that I'm making, I'm a convicted felon of a manufactured charge, but actually it works to my advantage because that's evidence of a war crime. See, now it works to my advantage because guess what? Now I got transcripts. I got all the pleadings. And you go back and read. I was saying, this is illegal. You cannot do this. You must administer the laws of the Hawaiian Kingdom. But I really thought I was crazy back then. I got a PhD. See, back then, you go, oh, Keanu. Now, well, according to Dr. Sai. You know, one of my doctoral students actually told me, hey, Keanu, I was up at Sinclair Library, Wong's Audiovisual, and he said, I saw a DVD called Hawaiian Kingdom Law, Keanu Sai, 1998. Was filmed at QOCC, Queen Liliuokalani Children's Center in Hilo. Namakuka, and I filmed it. Right? It was 4.5 hours. So he borrowed it and he watched it. He calls me and goes, "Pra." And I was using transparencies on an overhead projector. No, you guys got to go get that video. He says, "You're saying the same thing except you got PhD at the end of your name now." I said, "Well, at least I've been consistent." Okay, so let's continue. You guys okay? Yes. Okay. See, as an instructor of classes for quite a while, I like to engage the audience so that you can understand what's going on. I'm not trying to just shove it down your throat, right? So you guys don't mind that I kind of play like this, right? Because that's actually how I teach at UH. Okay. Okay, right on. You know, because if somebody's talking to me about history, I come in, I'm falling asleep already. I say, Mr. Makanani, come on, give me something exciting. Okay, so first of 3 mandates that we must follow. Expose the occupation. Then ensure the United States complies with the laws of occupation, which is the Hague and Geneva Conventions. And then to prepare for an effective transition when the occupation comes to an end to a lawful government. We're only following precedents, right? That's all we're doing. We do not represent you. We represent the state. But all of this is going to come to a head. Because right now, it's all theory, right? It's like, well, the rules say it's supposed to work like this. This is how you're supposed to cook, usually on pressure cooker. Well, brother, you better know how to use a pressure cooker. Because that thing would blow up in front of you. So we have to understand that. I say, okay, we think we got it, right? So, you know, during that exposing Hawaii's occupation, there was a guy on the Big Island named Lance Larson. Just regular guy, electrician. I was at Shipman's Industrial Park, I think. And this was back in '97. And I'm giving a presentation about Hawaii using transparencies, saying, hey, you got to follow Hawaiian Kingdom law. You know, I know it's difficult, but my job is to expose. So he's telling me, so you're telling me we got to follow Hawaiian Kingdom? I say, hey, I can understand the situation. Yeah, you got it. And I said, perfect title, we're following it. That's why we got attacked. But I got to tell you, everybody here got to follow the law. So we had the civil codes, you know, the penal codes, all from Kinko's, right? Make copies, just education, just exposed. Well, this guy went back to his house, and he went through the law books, and he realized that there is no law that requires him to have a driver's license. Yeah, there's nothing in the civil code. Because 1893, you didn't have cars. Hey, you don't need driver's license. No, he had one. I'm just saying, but he doesn't need it. So what he did was, on his own, and I learned this not from him, but from actually his attorney in these pleadings that took place in this court. That's where I learned of it. Went to his truck, his Jeep Comanche, took off his license plates, scraped off his safety stickers and everything, put a big placard on the back of his truck, section 6 of the Hawaiian Civil Code, where it says the laws are obligatory upon all persons, whether subjects of this kingdom or citizens or subjects of any foreign state, while within the limits of this kingdom. Brother jumped in his car, no seatbelt, driver on hilo, get tickets. No, that was him, just driving, he got a lot of tickets. In fact, I know the officer that gave him a lot of those tickets, Officer Leland Pa. You know, good man. Bro, he's just riding around. So, he got to go trial. Well, he got to go before the judge. He has an attorney representing him. That attorney is Ninia Parks. Ninia Parks has a very interesting history. Ninia Parks, blonde-haired, haole girl, who just found out she's Native Hawaiian. Not just found out she was Native Hawaiian. She was adopted, raised in California. She came home to find her family. She found out that she's part Native Hawaiian. She was blown. Her genealogy actually showed that she was the direct descendant of William Kinney, Kinney, who prosecuted Queen Liliuokalani in that kangaroo court. And what she wanted to do was to make amends for her family. And she represented Hawaiian subjects, which one of them was Lance Larson. Yeah, she also represented Marie Beltran, North Shore.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah?
John
and John, Keawe Mohili, right? But that's what she was doing, giving back. Because that's what the education did for her. Because she's an attorney, a real attorney, not read a book, think the attorney. Right? But she's a real attorney from law school in California and came here to represent Lance Larson. So she asked me if I could be an expert witness, in this case at Kea'au District Court, where the old courthouse was, yeah? By Kea'au Shopping Center, right? So I went on as an expert witness. Now, you can't just go on as an expert witness. You got to be qualified. So you got to be voir dire. So basically, I went up, and the prosecutor got to zing me, test me. And I was answering his question. Well, it was real easy. Mind you, I don't have a master's degree or a PhD. But just like that I'm on the doctor committee, says I'm saying the same thing. So I'm saying the same thing without the PhD. And I'm answering the questions. All I have was a bachelor's. Just answering the question. The Judge Sandra Schutte, she goes, stop. Obviously, Mr. Sai is qualified in this area. I qualify him as an expert witness. Then Ninia Park starts asking me questions about the treaty. What is it? How does it work? Da-da-da. So in the absence of a treaty, American law, which is the Hawaii Revised Statutes on driver's license, wouldn't apply in Hawaii because Hawaii's not part of the United States. You got to show the treaty, right? So the Judge Sandra Schutte was kind of caught. Well, she went behind. We're all sitting there waiting. She went to her room in the back. She comes out after a long while, and she basically says to Lance, I'm going to fine you $900. I think it was $900. And she says, are you going to pay it? He said, no, you didn't show me the treaty. I think she saw it as a contempt. So she ordered him to be incarcerated. So he got locked up for 30 days, 7 days solitary confinement. Miss Parks was now looking at me in a very different light. She was looking at me as an expert witness for her case. Then she started looking at me as the provisional government. Because she knew it. She knew it. And she said, the council is responsible. You're supposed to be protecting Hawaiian subjects like my client. Because what she was afraid of was her client was going to get beat up in jail. That was her biggest concern. That's called a reality check. Right? So she wanted to file what is called a habeas corpus, try to get him out. So she filed a lawsuit in federal court. The judge for that case was Judge King, Samuel King. Yeah, he was a federal judge. So she filed this suit against the Hawaiian Kingdom, United States, and the United Nations. United Nations responded, said they got diplomatic immunity, so they're removed off the docket. Yeah. And then she found out that the United States was going to move to dismiss the case. And then she had a meeting with us, and she said, you folks are still accountable for my client. I said, we are responsible, but we're not liable because we didn't put him in jail. The United States did. But she was claiming we were negligent for allowing American laws to be imposed in Hawaii that led to her client's incarceration and unfair trial, which are war crimes under the Geneva Conventions, which she knew. Right? So I told her, we had a meeting, and I said, you know what, why don't you dismiss the United States off the docket? You don't have to worry about them moving for dismissal. And let's enter into a binding arbitration. So we entered into a stipulation of agreement to go binding arbitration at the Permanent Court of Arbitration. And Judge Samuel King signed off on it. So it leapfrogged from the federal court in Honolulu to the Permanent Court of Arbitration in The Hague. Does that make sense? Because that's actually what happened, right? Very legal, very procedural. Now, the Permanent Court of Arbitration, we told her they can hear this dispute. Because if we go to the federal court, that's an American court, no different than the court that put your client in prison. It's all illegal.
No jurisdiction.
No jurisdiction, wrong court, state of war. You got to administer Hawaiian Kingdom law. Because if you're administering Hawaiian Kingdom law, Lance Larson wouldn't be in prison. Period. So, the Permanent Court of Arbitration was established in 1899 when they're going to codify the laws of war. Right? Tsar Nicholas II convenes all the countries to come together, including the United States. Now, the Permanent Court of Arbitration was established under Hague Convention number 1, meaning this is where countries would go to resolve their disputes. If it doesn't work, then you go to war, then you use Hague Convention 2, 3, 4, and 5. That's how you're regulated now. Okay? Now, you have to be a state in order to access that court, an independent state. An existing state. Okay? So it is an international body. Now the Permanent Court of Arbitration, it has what is called institutional jurisdiction. You have to be a state to enter that court. Once they verify that, then they can create an ad hoc tribunal. A tribunal that is set up particularly for that particular dispute. And you bring in arbitrators that have background in that dispute. So if you have a dispute on law of the sea, right? Then you bring in arbitrators that have experience in the Law of the Sea Convention, like the South China Sea case between Philippines and China. Okay? The arbitrators there were experts in the Law of the Sea. If you have a dispute on boundaries, then you bring in arbitrators that have experience in that area, and so forth. That's what arbitration is. It's very fine-tuned toward the dispute at hand, as opposed to a court, which isn't an expert, but you got to bring in expert witnesses. Right? That's a different form of dispute resolution. So arbitration was the preferred method at the international level, because then you really get into it, and both parties will accept the decision made, because this guy, they know, they mutually agree, he's qualified to make a decision. So, they provide arbitration, and the Permanent Court is what is called an intergovernmental organization, which I said creates tribunals. So it has institutional jurisdiction in the following disputes between two states. Okay? So if two states have a dispute, they'll verify their states, and then they help facilitate the creation of a tribunal. So let's take an example here. Ecuador versus the United States of America. In 2011, Ecuador versus the United States had a dispute on a treaty provision, Article 2. The name of the claimant, Ecuador, state. United States of America, state. Then they create the tribunal. Okay? Next is between a state and an international organization. So back in, I believe, 2009, I think that's the right year, I'm not sure. This is Peru versus United Nations. Okay? This is a dispute, okay, between Peru, a state, United Nations, international organization. Then they form the tribunal. So can you understand, it's an institutional process first, and not they just say, come in and resolve anything you want. Because the Permanent Court of Arbitration facilitates the process of picking and selecting competent individuals to serve as the arbitrators. That's their function. And then you have between a state and a private party. So when the Hawaiian Kingdom's case went up, Larson versus Hawaiian Kingdom, name of the claimant, Lance Paul Larson, private entity, Hawaiian Kingdom state. They just verified Hawaii as an independent state. Just got verified. That's not me. That's from the Permanent Court of Arbitration. That means we were correct in our theoretical understandings. It's like, whew, yeah. Okay, we got it. Now, they just didn't say Hawaii was a state. They did their due diligence. When the case was submitted to the Permanent Court of Arbitration, the Secretariat, which is the registry, they received it in November of 1999. From November 1999 till February of 2000, they were vetting the question. The tribunal wasn't created yet. They were still vetting it. And then in the latter part of, in the mid-February, I get a call. Now I'm representing, there's Nina Parks, representing Lance Larson, and there's me representing the Hawaiian Kingdom. This also recognizes the fact that they recognize the acting government as representing the Hawaiian Kingdom. That's another verification that we needed from outside. Yeah. Well, as the defendant in this case, that's what the respondent is the defendant. As the defendant, I was called by the Secretary General, Van den Hout, Jocko, I think his name is. He's Dutch from the Foreign Ministry. When we spoke on the phone, he didn't call me. He actually called the Permanent Court of Arbitration for a procedural question, and they said, could you please hold on? The Secretary General would like to speak to you. So then he comes on the line and he says, Mr. Sai, we cannot find any evidence that the Hawaiian Kingdom does not exist. That's what he said. Couldn't find any evidence. And in fact, he admitted that the Hawaiian Kingdom's treaty with the Netherlands wasn't canceled. That's pretty heavy, no? So he says, in order to maintain the integrity of this case, he recommended to me that I travel to Washington with Nina Parks, attorney for Lance Larson, and provide a formal invitation to the United States of America to join in the arbitration. Because they were the ones who arrested Lance Larson and put him on trial, not us. We were being alleged to have been negligent for allowing the unlawful imposition of American law. Not the ones who committed the violations against Lance Larson. We were being accused of being negligent. It's like a tort type of issue. So I said, good point. I knew what that was about. If anybody can refute or dispute the existence of the Hawaiian Kingdom and the Hawaiian government, it would be the United States of America. So I went to Washington, D.C., myself and Nina, had a meeting with John Crook. Real name, John Crook. He actually represented the United States at the International Court of Justice. I'm not even making this stuff up, too. I mean, I personally don't know the guy, but, you know, he was shocked that the case was accepted by the court. You understand why he was shocked? Because in his eyes, he thought Hawaii was the 50th state. They're not even supposed to be in the building. It's like, we should have went like this, but nobody's answering the door. We went, they opened the door, come on in. Then I said, hey, why don't you go to America and ask them if they want to come in too? So after I said what the purpose of our meeting was, at the request of the Secretary General, because I told him our meeting is going to be reduced to writing, that the United States has been given an invitation explicitly to join in the arbitration. And what they could do is contact the Permanent Court of Arbitration and say, stop. This is a violation of our sovereignty. Hawaii is a part of the United States. And then we'll say, good, prove it. We're already up here. We'll change the dispute. We'll have the dispute on whether or not the state of Hawaii is legal. What they ended up doing was contacting the court about 2 weeks later from their embassy in Hawaii and said that they had no intention of joining the arbitration, but they asked permission from the Hawaiian government and Lance Larson if they could have access to all the records pleadings. So I get a call from the Deputy Secretary General, Phyllis Hamilton, who's an American, calls me and says that the American Embassy notified them and that on behalf of the American Embassy, she's asking, would the Hawaiian Kingdom consent to the United States having access to all records? I said, absolutely. And then the same thing was done with Lance Larson's attorney, Nina. Now right there, two things happened. One, the United States did not dispute the existence of the Hawaiian Kingdom as a state. Second, they directly acknowledge and recognize the Hawaiian government by asking permission to have access to the records. Because we're in The Hague. We're not just some private entity up here trying to pretend something to be something we're not. That was powerful. But that's what happens when you walk in knowing the rules, right? If you're a government, you act like one. If you're in a country, you're in a country, right? If you can show we're not a country, good. If not, I'm walking. I'm going to keep walking through these halls. You know, I remember in the Army, Colonel once told me, "Lieutenant, you walk like you have a purpose in life, even though you don't have one." Yes, sir. Provisional government. Just make like you know what's going on, and you go figure it out later. But I knew due diligence before I do it. But you can see the level we're going from perfect title, to here. And I'm walking you through that, but I'm explaining to you the context, right? Because it looks so simple, right? It actually was when you know the rules. What's so mind-blowing is nobody knows the rules in Hawaii. So here's what the American Journal of International Law reported on this case. The American Journal of International Law, not Keanu making a statement. I had nothing to do with this because the American Journal of International Law reports on international proceedings and cases. Yeah, that's what they do, as well as having law journal articles on topics. So in that article regarding this case, it says at the center of the PCA proceeding, which is the permanent court arbitration, was that the Hawaiian Kingdom continues to exist and that the Hawaiian Council of Regency, representing the Hawaiian Kingdom, is legally responsible under international law for the protection of Hawaiian subjects, including the claimant, Lance Larson. In other words, the Hawaiian Kingdom was legally obligated to protect Larson from the United States' lawful imposition over him of its municipal laws through its political subdivision, the state of Hawaii. As a result of this responsibility, Larson submitted or argued the Hawaiian Council of Regency should be liable for any international law violations that the United States had committed against him. That's exactly what the case is. That's exactly what the case was about. And you know, when I came home and I'm trying to explain it to people in Hawaii, they thought I was making stuff up. They're trying to argue with me. I'm like, what? No, that's not what happened. Really? Okay. Let me go get my master's degree at UH and my PhD, so then now I can say the same thing, but now doctor in front of my name. But they nailed it. That's exactly what it is. So Lance Larson was coming after the acting government for not protecting him because the imposition of these American laws is what caused his problem. That's what the case was all about. But in order to even address that, you got to have a government and you need a subject. This was not about whether or not the kingdom exists. It wasn't. It exists. That's why we had the case. So that's the permanent court of arbitration. That's me up there with the beard, trying to look distinguished. Walk like you have a purpose in life. But when you watch the video, there's a mini documentary that was done. I watched that and I still tripped out on what I was saying. Yeah. Like, wow, this guy kind of knows what he's talking about. That's me. You still got to be humble. A couple of cracks from your auntie. Hey, you still Keanu. Oh, yeah, I know. But we had to play the role. We were representing our country at the international level where China, where the South China Sea case was. You know, this is big. So the case here was whether or not Lance Larson can come after the acting government. That's what it was. Now, the tribunal, after all the pleadings were submitted, came up with a procedural order in July that said the tribunal was asked to a judge make a determination whether or not the United States violated Lance Larson's rights when they had him on trial and locked him up. Once they determined that the United States violated Lance Larson's rights, those specific rights, the next stage of that procedural order is for the tribunal to adjudge and determine whether or not the Hawaiian government is liable for the violation of those rights. Now, what's going to come up here is the United States is not participating in the proceedings, but they're getting all the information. They're not participating. So this naturally raises a rule that the tribunal had to deal with, and it's called indispensable third-party rule. Okay? An indispensable third-party rule is a rule at the international courts, which says if a tribunal or court is going to look at the conduct of a state, whether it's lawful or unlawful, that state has to participate in the proceedings. If they don't participate, the case cannot continue. Okay? So the first precedent case on indispensable third party was a case called Monetary Gold, removed from Rome, 1943. This was Italy versus United States, Great Britain, and France. The indispensable third party was the owner of the gold, Albania. And Albania, as a state, refused to participate in these proceedings. So Italy could not go after France, Great Britain, and the United States because of the indispensable third party rule. So that's the first precedent case. Second was in the 1990s, East Timor. In that case, Australia was being sued by Portugal because Australia, after Portugal left East Timor, because it's a Portuguese colony, and allowed East Timor to work under the United Nations to be decolonized and become its own country, which it is now. When Portugal left, Indonesia invaded East Timor and started to tap into their resources. And then they entered into an agreement with Australia to do offshore mining. And that was the East Timor case. So Portugal was saying that's a violation of their sovereignty because it's still a Portuguese colony. So they filed a suit, Portugal versus Australia, at the International Court of Justice, but the indispensable third party came on, Indonesia. Because before they can go after Australia, Australia was saying Indonesia gave us the authority to mine. That became an indispensable third party. Indonesia said, we're not stepping into the court. So Portugal could not maintain its suit. So that is a second precedent case on indispensable third party. So during these proceedings, Lance Larson's attorney had to overcome this precedent, the precedent set by these two cases. What we're going to do, we're going to make use of that forum. We're going to share Hawaii's history. That's what we did, right? But I also said what we need from the tribunal is what came before the occupation. Right now, the Hawaiian Kingdom as an independent state is procedurally confirmed, right, through the Permanent Court of Arbitration. That's why we're there. I need something from the tribunal. I need something that I can use to cite. Yeah, it's called dictum. I need something. So you're going to see in the video, if you guys ever see the video, I don't have it here, but if you go online, you're going to see what we need from the tribunal is what came before the occupation. What was the status of Hawaii? Its status as an independent state. Because if I can get something before the occupation, all I'm saying is, when was Hawaii's independence acknowledged by the United States? Because we know it's acknowledged now. That's how we got into the court. But maybe we were like Japan, right? American laws could be imposed in Hawaii, right? Remember, unfair treaty? We talked about that. They weren't independent until 1890s. So I wanted something before. When did that recognition of Hawaiian independence come? And they gave it to us. Paragraph 7.4, arbitral award. A perusal of the material discloses that in the 19th century, the kingdom existed as an independent state recognized as such by the United States, Great Britain, and various other states. Boom. That's big. Why? Because America recognized the Hawaiian Kingdom as an independent state in the 19th century, which means only Hawaiian law applied since the 19th century to Lance Larson right now. That's what that means. That's why the word independence is very important. Countries fight to become independent states. Chechnya is fighting for it. Palestine is fighting for it. And here we got it already, and we're using all the wrong words. You know? Then they're going to address the issue that Lance Larson had to do with. Indispensable third party. Okay? So, paragraph 12:15. It follows that the tribunal cannot determine whether the respondent, which is the Hawaiian Kingdom, has failed to discharge its obligations toward the claimant, Lance Larson, without ruling on the legality of the acts of the United States. And that is precisely what the monetary gold, remember the first precedent case, principle precludes or prevents the tribunal from doing, because if you don't have them there, you can't proceed. As the International Court explained in the second case, East Timor, the court could not rule on the lawfulness of the conduct of a state called the Hawaiian Kingdom when its judgment would imply an evaluation of the lawfulness of the conduct of another state, the United States, is not a party. So we basically won the case. Lance Larson cannot sue the acting government without the United States participating. That's what happened. It was like talking to trees. See, we're all educated now. We can actually have a constructive dialogue. But they said the issues that are being presented could be taken up in another form of dispute resolution, where the indispensable third party won't apply. And that's called fact-finding. Fact-finding. So that's from the award. So it says here, at one stage of the proceedings, the question was raised whether some of the issues which the parties wish to present might not be dealt with by way of fact-finding. In addition to its role as a facilitator of international arbitration and conciliation, the Permanent Court of Arbitration has various procedures for fact-finding, both as between states and otherwise, a state and a private entity. A request that the tribunal should reconstitute itself as a fact-finding commission would have raised a number of issues. New agreement would have to have been done, blah, blah, blah. But they're saying, they acknowledge that that was a course that could be taken. The tribunal notes that interstate fact-finding commissions, meaning between states, so far held in the Permanent Court, have not confined themselves to pure questions of fact, but have gone on expressly or by clear implication to deal with the issues of responsibility. Who arrested Lance Larson? Put him on trial. Who locked them up? Who's responsible? It's called criminal liability under international law. So far, there have only been 5 international commissions of inquiry at the Permanent Court of Arbitration. First one, 1905, last one, 1967, I think. First one was between Russia and Great Britain. These fact-finding commissions of inquiry serve similar to grand juries. They determine liability for prosecution by a court, not fact-finders. So it's like a grand jury. So we had that option to go. But the problem is, who's going to pay for it? See, we're defendants in the case. Lance Larson was responsible for paying for everything. We're not going to help pay for you to come after us. Yeah, it's kind of crazy. He had to carry the costs. Not $150,000. So if we go to fact-finding, that means it's going to be either a shared cost, right? Or maybe we got to cover it. Well, we entered into an agreement, but we pulled out of it after. We said, you know what, we're not ready for this. And it was decided that the acting government, because of what happened, we decided that one of us has to go back to UH and begin to correct the misinformation. And since I already had my bachelor's degree back in 1987, I know it's taught Hawaiians as indigenous, colonization. That's all wrong. That's baseball. This is football. And I got the ace in my pocket. I'm coming from The Hague. It actually happened. So it was decided to UH, and the focus there was entered the political science program, get my master's degree specializing in international relations, write articles, write papers, get that mode of education and start engaging. I was not well liked at the University of Hawaii. Yeah, Hawaiian professors, they never liked me. Because I called it. I said, stop calling that colonization, it's occupation. Oh, it's semantics. No, it's not semantics. What, kidnapping, adoption, semantics. I wasn't disrespectful when I said those things. But that's what I was thinking. Because remember, I'm still a grad student. You can't say that to a professor. Like, I'm thinking that. I didn't say it. So what I do is I got to write articles that can qualify that, right? So, got my master's degree, got my PhD, started to teach. Now I'm not the only one teaching this. I'm not the only one that has this background. And I encourage education, constantly, right? But as things are moving, things came up where and kicked it off. Fact-finding. This is the South China Sea case between Philippines and China from 2013 and 2016. This is a case that was regarding the building of islands in the South China Sea by the Chinese.
Fake islands.
Okay. The question was, so that's what the case was about. Okay. And it centers on the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea. Okay. So in this case, they verified Philippines state, China state, right? And they created the tribunal. What came up in the tribunal was indispensable third party. Whether or not this tribunal is going to run afoul on indispensable third party. Who do you think the indispensable third parties will be? South China Sea. along the border, the countries bordering the South China Sea.
Yeah.
It's not China or the Philippines as an indispensable third party. Exactly, Malaysia, Vietnam, and particularly Vietnam. That's what they're looking at. Because what happens is, you got China, Vietnam, Indonesia, Malaysia, Brunei, Philippines.
Yeah.
They border the South China Sea. So the question the tribunal came up on their own was, will our decision affect conduct of states and third party rule? So the Philippines had to make an argument that it won't, and they succeeded in making that argument. And how they made that, how they got around that, their argument was, we're not asking the tribunal to look at conduct of states, we're just asking the tribunal to determine whether or not these islands or are they rocks. Because if they're islands, then it's a 200-mile radius, but it has to be natural made, not man-made. But if it's a rock, it's only 12 miles. That's what the case was about. So that way they're not looking at conduct of states. They're just looking at what is an island. And if you're building an island, that's called man-made. And the definition of an island under the Law of the Sea Convention is that it must be natural made. And it must be capable of human habitation. Because if it is capable of human habitation, then you can invoke a 200-mile radius, called it an exclusive economic zone, which China was invoking. But if it's rock, it's not 200 miles, it's only 12 miles, called the territorial sea. That's how they got around it. So they succeeded, then they went to the second. The issue of indispensable third party came up. And I was looking at this case, and I was like, I'm thinking in my head, what if they mention the Larson case, indispensable third party? Because right now there are two precedent cases, East Timor and monetary gold, right? Wow, here's the decision. Paragraph 181, the present situation is different from the few cases in which an international court or tribunal has declined to proceed due to the absence of an indispensable third party, namely monetary gold, removed from Rome in 1943, East Timor before the International Court of Justice, and Larson versus Hawaiian Kingdom. Oh. We are now the third precedent case. That's pretty heavy. That's like talking to the lead representative of Roe versus Wade, and I'm explaining to you guys what happened in the that's heavy. That means that when the Philippines, I read the Philippines, it wasn't about whether or not the Hawaiian Kingdom exists. It was about whether or not a national could come after the Hawaiian government for not protecting him without the United States participation. So it says in all of those cases, the rights of third states, respectively Albania, Indonesia, and the United States, would not only have been affected by a decision in the case, but would have formed the very subject matter of the decision. Additionally, in those cases, the lawfulness of activities by third states was in question, whereas here, none of the Philippines' claims entail allegations of unlawful conduct by Vietnam or other third states. So we are now at that level, and that's pretty heavy. And that's why people need to get educated on this. And this is what happens when you know how to play the game, right? So that was our cue. We're going fact-finding. We're going to take up what the arbitrators recommended. And we're going to set up a commission to serve as a grand jury and provide who's responsible for criminal activity against Lance Larson. And then move to prosecute them by some court or tribunal, whether the International Criminal Court, a court exercise. So it also covers not only arbitration, but fact-finding. We're going to move to be the sixth case of fact-finding. So, International Commission of Inquiry will be comprised of 3 commissioners appointed in accordance with the Hague Convention number Part 3. It'll be 2 stages. First, what is the function and role of the government of the Hawaiian Kingdom in accordance with the basic norm and framework of international humanitarian law? What is humanitarian law? Laws of war. That's what it is. Right? Now, in order to understand what is the function and role of the government, see, we basically came to this agreement with Lance Larson. Before you can accuse us of being negative, what's our role? I mean, the law says what we got to do. But what about let's keep it in context. We don't even know what's going on. What is our role now? Well, we felt it's education. Now we're, so we came up, but obviously it didn't stop you from being put in prison. And we understand that. And we are still responsible for that, but we're not liable. But before we get there, let's talk about our role. And let's have an international body tell us what is our role in light of all of this. Right? See, that's important. Now remember, the laws of occupation and humanitarian law. Are there two legal orders that exist at the same time? Yes. That of the occupier and that of the occupied. Okay, we're the occupied. No effectiveness. So before this commission, you first see what is the role of the occupier since 1893, January 16th, the state of war, when it began. Let's now flush that out. Now, in light of from 1893 till today, with all of this information, that we have a lot of research already there. They don't have to do fact-finding all on their own. We got doctoral dissertations, got larger articles, a lot of research has already been done. In light of all of that, now we can answer that question. And then we'll get into what we did and how we addressed this problem. We didn't just sit and be idle. We had a plan. But given the situation, this was the only plan that we could actually work. The proof is in the pudding, not the recipe, Right now we're tasting some pretty good pudding. Once they answer this, which they have to answer after they answer the role of the occupier, then they get into second, what are the duties and obligations of the Hawaiian Kingdom toward Lance Larson, and by extension to all Hawaiian subjects residing in Hawaii and abroad. Okay, now we're getting into the meat. Compliance. So, went ahead. I got a person on my legal team. He's my deputy agent. He's a professor of international law from the University of Siena in Italy. Professor Federico. I encourage all of you to watch that because that was really great. What Commitment Schools put on, very professional. And Professor Lenzerini was totally blown away. I mean, hula, presentation of a flag, me and him on a table with the Hawaiian flag and the Italian flag. We have a lot of connections to Italy, Robert Wilcox was educated at the military academy at Torino. Actually attended that military academy when I gave a talk at the University of Torino. Was given a full tour by the TAC officers. Wow. I could put myself in the shoes of Willie Koki. It was almost like I was going back to New Mexico Military Institute. So I asked the instructors, how do you went all into it? I was like, wow, this is heavy. This guy, Robert Wilcox, was highly trained. If he came home before 1887, there wouldn't be one bayonet. Guaranteed. Well, he came home after. And that's when he was like a lion without a leader. Right? I could totally see that. But I have a lot of respect for that man after walking through that military academy. And countries of Europe would send their men over to that military academy to be trained as field artillery officers. Did you know we had a Hawaiian woman, Maile Boyd, 1880s. Maile Boyd, study abroad, Kalakaua, sent her over to learn sculpture at the University of Torino. Her brother, I think, the other boy, went to Naples Military Academy. It was like a high school military. A lot of connections with Europe and Italy. So, also on my legal team, I went to London. I needed to build up my team before these proceedings begin. So the Matrix Chambers was the one that represented the Philippines in the jurisdictional argument on the indispensable third party rule. So I drafted that brief before my meeting to prep them for it, and I found out that they were pretty much aware of our case. I was just filling in the colors. They're on board. So everything we do costs. You know, this is not kokua. You know, my father-in-law once told me, you know, kokua. I went to his funeral. You know, so that's what came. International James and they